I stared at the small brass key still trembling in the lock of my daughter-in-law's desk. Just 30 minutes ago, a trusted neighbor warned me that Chloe was hiding legal packages addressed in my name and sneaking around with a man who was definitely not my son. She spun around with a sickly sweet smile, calling me Dad, but my 30 years as a federal forensic accountant told me one terrifying truth. This woman was robbing me blind, and I was going to tear her perfect little life apart piece by piece. I am Leroy, 73 years old, and until recently I thought I could peacefully enjoy my retirement. As a former investigator for the IRS, I spent my life hunting down corporate frauds, embezzlers, and white-collar criminals. I can spot a liar from a mile away just by looking at a balance sheet. I thought I left that dark world behind to enjoy my golden years. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart someone who thought you were just a clueless old man. It all started on a chilly Thursday evening. I was on my way to my son David's house for our usual weekly family dinner. I decided to stop by the local convenience store to pick up a decent bottle of red wine. I was wearing my usual faded flannel shirt and scuffed leather boots. When people look at me, they just see a tired old black man living on a fixed pension. That is exactly how I like it. In my line of work, you learn early on that projecting wealth only attracts vultures. True power lies in being entirely underestimated. I was standing in the wine aisle comparing vintage dates when a hand suddenly gripped my forearm. I turned and saw Mrs. Higgins. She lived 2 houses down from David and Chloe. She was an older woman, sharp as a tack, who knew everything happening in the neighborhood. Leroy, she whispered, her eyes darting around the store as if we were being followed. I need to tell you something, and you need to listen to me very closely. I put the wine bottle down and gave her my full attention. I could see the genuine concern etching lines into her face. "What is it, Martha?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "Your daughter-in-law is hiding something," she said, her voice tight with a nervous energy. I raised an eyebrow. "Chloe. Hiding what exactly?" "Last Tuesday, I was walking my dog past their driveway," Martha explained, leaning in closer. "I saw the mail carrier hand Chloe a thick, certified envelope. I have good eyes, Leroy. The name printed on that envelope is yours. Not David's, not hers. Yours." My forensic accountant brain immediately clicked into gear, processing the variables. I receive all my mail at my own house across town. I never forward anything to David's address. Legal documents and certified mail require signatures. "Did she bring it inside the house?" I asked, keeping my tone completely neutral, masking the alarm bells ringing in my head. "No," Martha said, shaking her head vigorously. "That is the strange part." She looked around like she was terrified someone would catch her. Then she practically ran to her luxury SUV and shoved the envelope deep under the spare tire in the trunk. But that is not even the worst of it, Leroy. I waited, letting the heavy silence draw the rest of the truth out of her. 10 minutes later, a car pulled up. Martha continued, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. A sleek silver sports car. A white man got out. He was tall, wearing an expensive tailored suit. He was definitely not David. Chloe ran right up to him, hugged him, and they drove off together, leaving her car in the driveway. She left the house completely empty in the middle of the day. A certified package in my name, hidden in a trunk, and a secret daytime meeting with an unknown man. I did not gasp. I did not act shocked. Over 3 decades, hunting down tax evaders taught me that reacting emotionally only clouds your judgment and tips off your target. I simply patted Martha on the shoulder. "Thank you for looking out for me, Martha. Let us keep this conversation strictly between us for now." I paid for my wine and walked out to my old pickup truck. As I gripped the steering wheel, my mind started running the numbers and connecting the dots. Criminals always leave a paper trail. Always. If a certified document bearing my name was delivered to their address, it meant someone had officially redirected my mail or intercepted a highly sensitive legal or financial document. David is a good man. I raised him by myself after his mother passed away, to be honest, hardworking and fiercely loyal. He is a senior manager at a regional logistics firm, bringing in a very solid income. But lately he had been looking completely exhausted. He had dark circles under his eyes, he was losing weight, and he always seemed stressed out of his mind. He claimed it was just intense pressure from upper management. I was beginning to suspect the pressure was coming from inside his own home. Chloe, on the other hand, was an entirely different story. She played the role of the perfect supportive wife to the letter. She smiled too much, she complimented me too often, and she always complained to David about how tight money was while walking around wearing designer shoes and carrying bags that cost thousands of dollars. I never trusted her. Her eyes were always calculating, always assessing what she could extract from any given situation. I pulled into their quiet suburban driveway. The silver sports car Martha mentioned was nowhere to be seen. Just David's practical sedan and Chloe's massive luxury SUV. I grabbed the wine and walked up the front steps. I did not bother knocking. I still had the spare key David gave me years ago for emergencies. I unlocked the front door, silently pushing it open without making a sound, and stepped into the hallway. The house was quiet. It was far too quiet for a household expecting a dinner guest in 15 minutes. I walked softly toward the living room. The floorboards in this modern house creak near the main staircase, so I deliberately kept my weight on the thick edges of the hallway runner. As I approached the home office, I heard the frantic, aggressive rustling of heavy paper. I stopped and peeked around the corner. Chloe was standing by the heavy mahogany desk. She was frantically shoving a thick stack of manila folders into the bottom drawer. Her hands were physically shaking. She slammed the heavy drawer shut and shoved a small brass key into the lock, turning it with a sharp, definitive click. I stepped fully into the doorway, letting my heavy boots thud loudly against the hardwood floor. Chloe gasped loudly. She spun around, her hand flying to her chest in absolute panic. Her face drained of all color, turning stark white, but within a fraction of a second, she plastered on that sickeningly sweet artificial smile. "Dad," she chirped, her voice trembling and pitching an octave too high. "You startled me. I did not hear you come in at all. David is just upstairs changing out of his work clothes." I looked at her. I looked at her expensive silk blouse and the heavy diamond tennis bracelet catching the light from the desk lamp. Then I let my cold gaze drop slowly, deliberately downward. I stared directly at the small brass key. She was in such a state of sheer panic that she had forgotten to take it out of the lock. "Just doing some organizing?" I asked, my voice a low, steady rumble. "Yes," she laughed nervously, stepping quickly to the side as if her petite body could somehow block my view of the locked drawer. "Just filing away some old, boring tax returns and household bills. You know how messy David can get with his paperwork. We are so happy you are here for dinner. Please let me take your coat." I smiled back at her. A slow, calculated, chilling smile. "Tax returns," I said, holding out the bottle of wine for her to take. "You know, Chloe, I always loved a good tax return. They tell you exactly who a person really is when they think nobody else is looking." Her fake smile faltered for a microsecond, her eyes flashing with a sudden hit of pure fear, before she quickly turned her back and hurried toward the kitchen. I stood completely alone in the office for a brief, silent moment. I committed the exact shape and make of that brass key to memory. Whatever was locked inside that drawer was the reason a certified letter in my name had been hidden in her car trunk. I knew right then that I was not just here for a casual family dinner. I was here to initiate an audit, and this one was going to be absolutely merciless. The dining room smelled of roasted chicken and expensive perfume. I took my seat at the long mahogany table, watching my son walk slowly down the stairs. David looked like a ghost of the strong, proud man I had raised. He had dark, heavy circles under his eyes, and his shoulders slumped as if he was carrying the entire weight of the world on his back. He gave me a weak smile and sat down heavily across from me, loosening his tie with trembling fingers. "How is work, son?" I asked, passing him a bowl of salad. I kept my voice gentle, playing the role of the sweet, concerned father. He rubbed his temples and let out a long, exhausted sigh that seemed to come from the very bottom of his soul. "It is a nightmare, Dad," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I am dealing with a massive headache at the logistics firm. We have a significant financial deficit in our quarterly accounts. Large sums of money are just missing, and the numbers are not adding up no matter how many times I run the reports. Upper management is breathing down my neck to find out where the leak is. I am working 80-hour weeks trying to audit my own department before the federal regulators get involved. I feel like I am losing my mind." I watched him closely. My son was a deeply honest man. I raised him by myself after his mother passed away, teaching him that integrity was the only currency that truly mattered. If corporate money was missing, he was definitely not the one taking it. But as a former forensic accountant for the IRS, I knew the harsh reality of corporate theft. When money disappears without a trace, the thief is usually someone with intimate access, blind trust, and a very good cover story, someone close. someone you would never suspect. Right on cue, Chloe walked into the dining room carrying a silver tray of roasted vegetables. She sighed dramatically and sat next to David, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "We are just under so much financial stress lately, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with a fake sympathy that made my stomach turn. "With inflation and the cost of groceries going up so high, we are really having to tighten our belts. It is getting so hard just to make the monthly mortgage payments on this big house. I might have to start cutting back on everything just to keep us afloat." I looked at her. I listened to her complain bitterly about the price of basic groceries and the burden of their mortgage. Then I let my eyes drift down to the hand she had resting so lovingly on my son's arm. Wrapped around her wrist, gleaming brilliantly under the warm light of the dining room chandelier, was a brand new solid gold Cartier watch, a Cartier Ballon Bleu to be exact, studded with a halo of flawless diamonds. During my 30 years hunting down white-collar criminals, tax evaders, and corporate embezzlers, I had seized enough luxury assets to know the exact market price of that specific timepiece. It was worth at least $15,000. She was sitting there wearing a down payment for a house on her wrist, while looking me dead in the eye and telling me they could barely afford to eat. The absolute audacity of this woman made my blood boil. The rage inside me was cold and sharp like a razor blade, but my face remained a perfect mask of grandfatherly concern. "Oh my," I said softly, shaking my head. "Times are certainly tough everywhere. You kids just need to be very careful with your spending right now." Chloe nodded vigorously, totally unaware that I was reading her like an open ledger. "Exactly, Dad," she said, taking a delicate sip of her expensive red wine. "We just have to make smart choices and sacrifice for the family." I needed more information. I needed to see what else she was hiding in plain sight. In my old line of work, we call this the distraction maneuver. You create a physical diversion to break the target's line of sight. I picked up my silver fork and intentionally let my right hand tremble violently. I allowed the heavy fork to slip from my fingers and clatter loudly against the hardwood floor, bouncing deep under the table. "Oh, please excuse my clumsy old hands," I muttered, leaning forward with a fabricated groan. "Let me get that." David immediately started to rise from his chair, saying he would get it for me, but I was already ducking under the long table. Down in the shadows, completely away from their eyes, my hand stopped shaking instantly. My movements became precise and calculated. I looked around the floor. Right next to Chloe's expensive designer high heels sat her open leather handbag. She had dumped it carelessly on the floor, probably in her rush to serve dinner. Sticking out of the top zipper compartment was a thick, folded piece of heavy paper. The top corner was fully visible. It bore the distinct blue octagon logo of Chase Bank. My heart turned to pure ice. David does not bank at Chase. He has used the local credit union since he was a teenager. I am the one who banks at Chase. My entire life savings, my government pension, and my retirement funds are secured at that specific institution. Why would my daughter-in-law have a physical document from my personal bank shoved hastily inside her luxury purse? The pieces of the puzzle were slamming together with terrifying speed. The certified letter in my name hidden in the trunk of her car. The secret daytime meeting with the unknown white man. The brand new diamond Cartier watch. The missing funds at David's company. And now my highly confidential bank statement in her possession. She was not just cheating on my son. She was executing a highly coordinated financial drain on my family. I grabbed the fork, put my frail old man mask back on, and slowly lifted myself back into my chair, letting out another soft, tired groan for added effect. "Got it," I smiled warmly. My joints are just not what they used to be these days. The rest of the dinner was an absolute masterclass in deception. I ate my food, smiled politely at Chloe's ridiculous lies, and offered gentle words of encouragement to my exhausted son. I played the role of the slow, oblivious senior citizen to absolute perfection. I knew that the moment they suspected I was onto them, they would panic and destroy the paper trail. I needed the evidence intact. When the meal was finally over, I stood up and slowly put on my faded flannel coat. David walked me to the front hallway, looking like he was ready to collapse from sheer exhaustion. "You get some rest, son," I told him, pulling him into a tight, warm embrace. "Whatever is happening at your company, you will figure it out. You are a smart man, David. Do not let this break you." He hugged me back tightly, burying his face in my shoulder. "Thanks, Dad," he whispered, sounding like a scared little boy. I really needed to hear that. Chloe stood by the entryway console table, offering me that same sickeningly sweet artificial smile. "It was so lovely to have you for dinner, Dad," she said, her voice echoing in the hallway. "Please drive home safely. The roads can be so tricky at night." As I stepped toward her for a goodbye hug, my eyes scanned the surface of the wooden console table. There, resting carelessly next to a decorative ceramic vase, was a small brass key. It was the exact same key she had frantically used to lock her desk drawer earlier that evening when I caught her hiding the manila folders. She had been so rattled by my sudden appearance in her home office that she had absent-mindedly dropped the key in the hallway instead of hiding it. I reached out to hug her, patting her gently on the back. As I pulled away, I let my right hand brush smoothly over the surface of the console table. With the silent, practiced precision of a seasoned federal investigator, I palmed the brass key and slipped it deep into my coat pocket without making a single sound. "Thank you for dinner, Chloe," I said, looking her dead in the eyes with a warm, grandfatherly smile. "I truly appreciate everything you are doing behind the scenes for this family." I walked out the front door and down the driveway to my old pickup truck. The cool night air hit my face, but I did not feel the chill. The anger burning inside my chest was keeping me perfectly warm. I climbed into the driver's seat, closed the door, and pulled the small brass key from my pocket. I rolled the cold metal between my fingers. It felt heavy with dark secrets. I started the engine and pulled out of their driveway, but I had absolutely no intention of going home to sleep. I was going to drive a few blocks away, park my truck in the shadows, wait for the lights in their house to go completely out and come right back. Tonight, the old man in the faded flannel shirt was going to conduct a midnight audit, and God help whoever was on the wrong side of my ledger. I sat in the freezing cabin of my pickup truck parked 3 quiet streets away from my son's house. I watched the green digital clock on my dashboard slowly tick forward. 12:30, 1:15, 1:45. Finally, it hit 2 in the morning. The suburban neighborhood was dead silent, wrapped in a thick blanket of cold night air. The only sound was the slow, steady beating of my own heart. In my 30 years working for the federal government, I had conducted hundreds of audits. I had raided corporate offices. I had seized offshore accounts. But I had never audited my own family. I stepped out of the truck and walked the 3 blocks, keeping to the shadows cast by the large oak trees. I did not feel the cold. I only felt a deep, simmering focus. I reached the front door of David's house and pulled out my spare key. I slipped it into the lock, turning it with agonizing slowness to avoid the metallic click that echoes in the quiet of the night. I pushed the door open just enough to slide my body through and closed it silently behind me. The house was pitch black. Not a single light was on. Upstairs, David and Chloe were fast asleep. He was probably tossing and turning, consumed by the phantom stress of his missing corporate funds. She was probably sleeping like a baby, completely undisturbed by the gravity of her crimes. I moved through the hallway like a ghost. I knew exactly which floorboards to avoid. I stepped into the home office and gently pulled the curtains shut, blocking out the faint glow of the streetlights. I took a small, high-powered flashlight from my coat pocket and clicked it on, keeping the beam pointed directly at the floor. Then I reached into my other pocket and pulled out the small brass key I had taken from the console table. I walked over to the heavy mahogany desk. I slid the brass key into the bottom drawer. It turned with a soft, satisfying click. I pulled the heavy drawer open. Inside, sitting perfectly neat and organized, was a thick stack of manila folders. I carefully lifted the entire stack and placed it on the desk. I pulled out my reading glasses and began to work. It only took me 15 minutes. 15 minutes to unravel a web of deceit that would have taken an average person months to understand. But I am not an average person. I am a forensic accountant. I do not just look at numbers. I look at the story the numbers are desperately trying to hide. I opened the first folder. Right on top was a legal document bearing the seal of the state. It was a general power of attorney. I scanned the text. This document supposedly granted Chloe full, unrestricted legal authority to manage all financial and real estate assets belonging to Leroy Jackson. Me. I looked down at the signature line. There was my name written out in blue ink. To an untrained eye, it looked like a perfect match. It had the same slant, the same loops, the same general pressure points I use when I sign my checks. But they made a fatal mistake. They forgot who they were stealing from. I leaned in close, bringing the beam of my flashlight right over the signature. I tilted the paper, catching the light at an angle. When a human hand writes with a ballpoint pen, the metal tip presses into the paper, creating a microscopic physical indentation. The ink pools slightly at the end of the strokes. This signature had none of that. It was entirely flat. The blue coloring was composed of microscopic uniform dots. It was a high-resolution laser print. She had taken an old document I had signed, probably a birthday card or an old tax return, scanned it, isolated the signature, and printed it directly onto this fraudulent legal document. It was a federal crime. I felt a cold rage wash over me as I opened the second folder. This one contained heavy legal parchment from a major national bank, a mortgage agreement. My eyes scanned the lines of text and locked onto the property address. It was my house. The house I had lived in for 40 years. The house I had fully paid off in 1998. The house where I raised David after his mother passed away. Chloe had used the forged power of attorney to take out a massive home equity loan against my fully owned property. I looked at the principal amount, $250,000. She had mortgaged my life, my sanctuary, my memories for $250,000. I felt my chest tighten. This was why she was hiding the certified mail. The bank was sending the final approval notices and the closing documents directly to me, but she had intercepted them using the forged power of attorney to redirect the mail to her address. She had literally stolen the roof over my head without me ever suspecting a single thing. But the golden rule of forensic accounting is that you always follow the money. $250,000 does not just vanish into thin air. It has to land somewhere. I opened the third and final folder. It was a stack of bank wire transfer receipts. I scanned the routing numbers, expecting to see the funds deposited into David's joint checking account. If she was truly stealing this money to save my son from his supposed corporate debt, the money would be staged there ready to be deployed to save his career. But the money was not there. It was nowhere near David's accounts. I dragged my finger across the wire transfer receipt following the destination line. The entire lump sum of $250,000 had been wired to a completely different banking institution. It was deposited into a commercial checking account registered to a limited liability company. I read the name printed in bold black letters. Sunrise Ventures. Sunrise Ventures. I had never heard that name in my entire life. David had never mentioned any business by that name. It was a shell company, a financial ghost town set up for the sole purpose of washing dirty money. My mind raced through 1,000 different scenarios. If Chloe was stealing my house to pay off David's missing corporate funds, why route it to a blind shell company? It made absolutely no logical sense unless David was never the intended recipient of this money at all. I took my phone from my pocket and carefully photographed every single page of the documents. Every signature, every routing number, every bank seal. I made sure the flash was off, capturing the evidence in the sharp beam of my small flashlight. Once I had a complete digital copy of her entire fraudulent empire, I meticulously placed the papers back into the manila folders exactly the way I had found them. I returned the folders to the bottom drawer, closed it, and used the small brass key to lock it tight. I wiped down the desk, the drawer handle, and the doorknob, making sure I left absolutely no trace of my midnight audit. I slipped the brass key back into my pocket and crept out of the office. I walked back down the dark hallway, slipping out the front door and locking it silently behind me. The cold night air hit my face again, but this time it felt sharp and clear. I walked back to my truck in the shadows, my mind completely consumed by one single burning question. The money from my stolen house was sitting in a phantom account. I had the routing number. I had the company name. By tomorrow morning, I would use every contact I had left in the federal government to tear that shell company wide open. Chloe thought she was a criminal mastermind. She thought she had outsmarted a clueless old man, but she had no idea what was coming for her. I started the engine of my truck, staring into the darkness of the suburban street. Who is the real owner of Sunrise Ventures? And what exactly are they planning to do with my $250,000? I did not call the police the next morning. Most people in my situation would have dialed the authorities the second they saw those forged mortgage documents locked inside that desk drawer. But I am not most people. I spent 30 years working as a forensic accountant for the federal government. I have tracked down offshore accounts, unraveled massive corporate embezzlement schemes, and locked away millionaires who thought they were untouchable. I know exactly how financial criminals think. They are arrogant and they always believe they are the smartest person in the room. If I called the police right now, it would be messy and premature. Chloe would just play the victim. She would cry real tears and tell the detectives that she forged the documents in a moment of panic to save David from his corporate debt. She would claim it was a misguided act of love. She might get a slap on the wrist, and David in his exhausted state might actually forgive her. I could not let that happen. You do not just step on a poisonous snake. You cut its head off entirely. And to do that, I needed to know exactly who was sitting at the other end of that stolen money. I poured myself a heavy cup of black coffee and sat down at my kitchen table, opening my encrypted laptop. I needed a favor from a man who still had his hands deep inside the federal databases. I dialed a number I had not called in 3 years. It belonged to an old colleague named Gordon. Gordon and I used to tear apart complex money laundering rings together back in the late 90s. He was still contracting for federal agencies and had security clearances that could pierce through any corporate veil in the country. When he answered, I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I told him I needed a massive favor. I read him the routing numbers I had photographed from Chloe's desk and gave him the target name, Sunrise Ventures. I told him I needed the registered owner, the incorporation documents, and the physical address of the business. Gordon knew better than to ask why an old retired accountant was running background checks at 8 in the morning. He simply told me to give him an hour and hung up. I spent that hour pacing my living room and watching the neighborhood wake up outside my window. My mind kept drifting back to David. I thought about how pale and exhausted he looked at the dinner table. My son was working 80-hour weeks trying to figure out why his logistics company was bleeding money. He was terrified of federal regulators and corporate audits. My son was drowning in stress while the woman holding his hand at the dinner table was the one holding his head underwater. I was starting to realize that the missing money at David's company and the stolen money from my house were part of the same massive bleeding wound. My phone buzzed loudly on the wooden table. It was Gordon. I put the call on speaker and leaned forward. His voice was grim and professional. He told me that Sunrise Ventures was a newly formed limited liability company registered just 3 months ago in the state registry. It had no real business footprint, no employees, and no commercial activity. It was a classic shell company designed strictly to hold and wash large sums of cash. Then Gordon gave me the name of the sole managing director, Trent. Gordon pulled up the driver's license photo from the registry and sent it directly to my phone. I stared at the bright screen. Trent was a tall white man in his late 30s with perfectly styled blonde hair, a sharp jawline, and a smug, arrogant smirk. He perfectly matched the exact description of the man my neighbor Martha had seen picking up Chloe in the silver sports car. But the real blow came next. Gordon read the registered business address for Sunrise Ventures out loud, and my blood ran absolutely cold. He recited a unit number in a luxury suburban condominium complex just 20 minutes outside the city limits. The air left my lungs. I did not just know that address. I owned that address. 10 years ago, I bought that specific condo as a quiet real estate investment using my retirement savings. I paid for it in pure cash. 3 years ago, when Chloe complained about feeling unfulfilled and wanting to start a career in property management, I made a generous mistake. I gave her the keys to that condo. I told her she could manage the rental agreements, handle the tenant maintenance, and keep a healthy percentage of the profits for her trouble. It was my way of helping her build a career. For 3 years, she sent me monthly spreadsheets showing modest rental income from a supposed traveling executive. It was all a disgusting lie. She was not renting my condo to a traveling executive. She had moved her white lover right into my property. She was letting Trent live in my luxury condo completely rent-free. They were using my property as the physical headquarters for their fake shell company. She was hiding him there, sleeping with him there, and funding their entire illicit affair using the money they were stealing from my house and from my son's company. The sheer audacity of it made me physically sick to my stomach. She was laying in a bed that I bought with 30 years of my own hard-earned money, laughing at my son while he worked himself into an early grave. The level of disrespect was so profound it almost left me breathless. She looked at my faded flannel shirt and my old boots and saw nothing but a blind, naive old man whose pockets she could pick at her leisure. She thought I was a pathetic fool who would just roll over and die so she could run off to the islands with her lover. But she was about to learn the hardest lesson of her miserable life. You never try to audit an auditor. I thanked Gordon for the information and ended the call. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing with strategies and legal traps. I needed to build a cage so tight that neither Chloe nor Trent could ever escape from it. I was going to use every legal loophole and financial trigger I knew to completely vaporize their stolen wealth. But before I could even write down the first step of my strategy, my laptop chimed with a high-priority notification. It was a secure automated email from Chase Bank. The subject line indicated an urgent legal request regarding my primary retirement accounts. I clicked the email open and read the text. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs. A formal petition had just been submitted to the bank by my daughter-in-law, Chloe. The email stated that she was requesting full executive control over my entire financial portfolio due to my rapidly declining mental health. She had initiated the final phase of her plan, but the bank had paused the request. They could not grant her access to the funds just yet. The email clearly stated that the bank required one final document to process the complete transfer of my life savings. They needed an official medical certificate signed by a licensed physician declaring that Mr. Leroy Jackson was completely incapacitated and suffering from severe dementia. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the words over and over again. She was not just trying to steal my money anymore. She was actively preparing to legally erase my mind. She needed a doctor to declare me insane, and I knew exactly how a woman like Chloe was going to get one. The game had just escalated to a matter of life and death. I knew Chloe was coming for me. After reading that email from the bank, I knew her next move was going to be an aggressive one. She needed a medical professional to declare me legally incompetent. But getting a legitimate doctor to sign away a perfectly healthy man's sanity is practically impossible. A real doctor would order blood tests, brain scans, and psychological evaluations. Chloe did not have time for that. She needed a shortcut. And in the world of financial crime, shortcuts always involve hiring a professional liar. I spent the morning preparing my stage. I did not clean my kitchen. I left dirty coffee mugs on the counter and scattered old newspapers across the living room floor. I wanted the house to look like the home of a man who was slowly losing his grip on reality. I put on an oversized cardigan that made me look frail and sunken. But the most important piece of my wardrobe was a small black button sewn right into the center of my shirt. It contained a high-definition micro camera and a digital audio recorder. I bought it from an old surveillance contact years ago. It was currently fully charged and recording every single thing in front of me. Around noon, a sleek black car pulled into my driveway. I watched through the window blinds as Chloe stepped out wearing a perfectly tailored beige dress. She walked around to the passenger side and was joined by a man holding a black leather briefcase. He wore a cheap gray suit and possessed the overly polished smile of a used car salesman. He did not walk like a doctor. He walked like a hustler. I unlocked the front door and shuffled back to my armchair, sitting down heavily and staring blankly at the muted television. The front door opened. Chloe walked into the living room, her high heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor. She rushed over to my chair, kneeling down next to me and placing her hands over mine. Her face was twisted into a mask of deep, tragic concern. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling with fabricated sorrow. "I came to check on you. You have been so forgetful lately, and David and I are just so incredibly worried about your health. We want to make sure you are safe." I looked at her blankly, letting my jaw hang slightly loose. I forced my hands to tremble under her grip. "Sarah," I whispered, using the name of my late wife. "Is that you, Sarah? Why are you wearing that dress?" Chloe let out a dramatic sigh and looked back at the man in the gray suit. "You see, Doctor," she said, wiping a non-existent tear from her eye. "It breaks my heart. He does not even know who I am half the time. He leaves the stove on and wanders around the house at night. It is getting dangerous." The man stepped forward, opening his briefcase. "Mr. Jackson," he said, using a smooth, practiced tone, "I am Dr. Evans. Chloe asked me to come by and have a little chat with you today. We just want to ask you a few simple questions to see how your memory is holding up." I looked at him, squinting my eyes as if I could barely focus on his face. "Doctor," I mumbled, "I do not need a doctor. I just need to find my keys. Have you seen my truck keys? I need to go to work. I have been retired for over a decade." Dr. Evans pulled a pen and a clipboard from his briefcase. He did not check my pulse. He did not shine a light in my eyes. He did not ask for my medical history. A real physician would have spent an hour evaluating my cognitive baseline. This man simply stood in my living room and began treating me like a toddler. "Can you tell me what year it is, Mr. Jackson?" he asked, checking his shiny gold watch. I let my head bob slightly.
Yeah, we know. Thank you.
1998, I said, my voice weak and raspy. Or maybe 99. "My boy David is at baseball practice." Chloe covered her mouth, pretending to stifle a sob. "It is getting worse every single day, doctor," she whispered. "He needs round-the-clock care. He cannot manage his own life anymore. We have to take over his affairs before he accidentally hurts himself or gives his money away to strangers." Dr. Evans nodded solemnly. He placed his clipboard on my coffee table. "It is a textbook case of advanced cognitive decline," he said with fake authority. "I see this all the time. He is completely incapacitated and unable to make rational decisions. I will sign the declaration of incompetence right now. This will give you the medical backing you need to activate your power of attorney and take full control of his estate." I watched him through the hidden camera on my chest. I made sure my body was angled perfectly so the lens captured his face, his hands, and the exact document he was signing. He scribbled his signature across the bottom of the federal medical form and handed it to Chloe. "Thank you, doctor," she breathed, clutching the paper to her chest as if it were a holy relic. "You have no idea how much peace of mind this brings to our family." She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a thick white envelope, handing it to the fake doctor. He slipped it into his jacket pocket without counting it. A cash payoff for a fraudulent medical diagnosis. They had just committed multiple federal felonies right in my living room, and I had the entire transaction captured in crisp, high-definition video and audio. I let my head droop down, pretending to fall asleep in my armchair. My hands were shaking, but this time it was not an act. It was the physical manifestation of pure, unadulterated rage. I was sitting mere inches away from the woman who was actively trying to erase my existence. Chloe stood up. "Let us go," she whispered to the fake doctor. "He is asleep. I have everything I need to send to the bank." As she turned to walk toward the door, she placed her designer handbag on the edge of the sofa to put her coat on. In that split second, when her back was completely turned, I moved with the silent speed of a predator. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a tiny GPS tracking and audio listening device. It was no bigger than a quarter. I slipped my hand silently into the open top of her purse and dropped the bug deep into the lining. I leaned back into my chair and closed my eyes just as she turned around. "I will call you if we need anything else," Dr. Chloe said, her voice laced with victory. They walked out the front door and closed it behind them. The lock clicked shut. The moment I was alone, my frail posture vanished entirely. I sat up straight and reached for the encrypted laptop I had hidden under the sofa. I opened it and instantly connected to the audio bug inside Chloe's purse. I put my headphones on and listened intently. I heard the sound of her car door opening and closing. I heard the heavy engine of her luxury SUV rumble to life. Then I heard the electronic beep of her phone connecting to the car's Bluetooth system. She was making a call. "Hey, baby?" she said, her voice completely dropping the tragic daughter-in-law act. It was replaced by a smug, arrogant tone. I heard Trent's voice coming through the car speakers. "Did you get the signature from the actor?" "Yes," she laughed, a cold, wicked sound. The old man was completely out of it. He thought it was the 90s. "Evan signed the paperwork, and I am emailing it to the bank right now. The retirement funds are ours. The old man is completely done." My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. She really thought she had won. She thought my life savings were already sitting in her pocket. "Perfect," Trent replied. "Then we are ready for the final stage. Did you set up the transfers on David's work computer?" "Yes," Chloe answered confidently. "I logged into his home office terminal last night while he was sleeping. I routed the final batch of missing corporate funds directly into the shell account. It is a masterpiece, Trent. All the IP addresses trace back to David's personal login credentials. The corporate auditors are going to find the leak by Friday." I stopped breathing. The air in my living room suddenly felt freezing cold. "When the federal regulators raid the logistics firm," Trent continued, "they are going to see that David was the one embezzling the company money. He is going to take the fall for all of it." "Exactly," Chloe laughed. "He will be facing 20 years in federal prison for corporate embezzlement. Everyone will think he stole the money because of his father's mounting medical bills. While the police are busy arresting David, we will be sitting on a beach in the Bahamas with his company funds and the old man's retirement savings. It is flawless." I pulled the headphones off my ears. The silence in my house was deafening. She was not just stealing my money. She was not just letting her white lover live in my condo. She was actively framing my son for a massive corporate crime. She was going to send my innocent, hard-working boy to federal prison to cover her own tracks. She was going to let a black man rot in a cell for 2 decades while she ran off with a white man to a tropical island. I stared at the blank television screen, my vision blurring with a storm of absolute fury. They wanted to destroy my entire bloodline. They wanted to bury David under a mountain of fake evidence and leave me to die in a nursing home. The game was no longer just about recovering stolen money. It was about saving my son's life. The corporate auditors were going to expose the leak by Friday. Today was Wednesday. I had exactly 48 hours to dismantle a highly sophisticated financial frame job, expose a medical fraud ring, and burn Sunrise Ventures straight to the ground. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Dr. Graham Montgomery, my newly hired cutthroat attorney. I did not care how much it was going to cost me. When he answered, I did not say hello. I just gave him an order. Graham. I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. We are moving to phase 2 right now. Gather the financial strike team. I am bringing down the hammer on Chloe and Trent, and I am going to make sure they do not even see the shadow falling over them. I did not wait for Graham to call me back. I grabbed the keys to my truck and walked out the door. The drive to my son's corporate logistics firm was a blur of gray concrete and cold, calculated anger. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles physically ached. Stealing my retirement money was one thing. Plotting to lock me inside a nursing home and drug me out of my mind was another. But trying to frame my son was a line that nobody crosses and walks away from. Trying to send a hard-working, innocent black man to a federal penitentiary to cover up her own sickening crimes was an act of pure evil. In this country, the justice system is a ruthless meat grinder. When corporate millions go missing and the digital footprint leads directly to a black executive, they do not stop to ask polite questions. They do not look for nuance. They bring chains and they destroy lives. Chloe knew exactly what she was doing. She was weaponizing the entire legal system against her own husband. I pulled into the sleek glass and steel corporate campus where David worked. I did not go to the front desk. I did not ask the receptionist for a visitor badge. 30 years as a federal agent teaches you how to walk into a building like you own the very foundation it sits on. I bypassed the security guards entirely, walking with the heavy, purposeful stride of a man who is about to shut the entire operation down. I took the elevator straight to the executive floor, bypassing the cubicles and conference rooms. I did not go to David's office. I went straight to the corner suite marked Chief Financial Officer. I pushed the heavy glass door open without knocking, letting it slam against the wall. A balding man in a custom-tailored suit looked up from his dual computer monitors, his face twisting into immediate outrage. He stood up, demanding to know who I was and reaching for his phone to call security. I walked right up to his desk, placed both my hands flat on the polished wood, and leaned in close. I told him my name was Leroy Jackson, former senior forensic investigator for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I told him I knew all about the massive financial hemorrhage in his quarterly accounts. I told him that if he did not turn his monitors around and show me the raw transaction logs this very second, I would make one phone call and have a team of federal agents tear his entire corporate structure apart before lunch. The color instantly drained from his face. Corporate executives are all exactly the same. The moment you mention a federal audit, they fold like cheap lawn chairs. He stammered, his hands shaking, asking how I possibly knew about the missing funds. I told him I did not come here to answer his questions. I came here to follow the money. I walked around his desk, pulled up a heavy leather chair, and ordered him to open the encrypted ledger. He nervously typed in his password, and the screen filled with thousands of lines of financial data. It was the internal audit report tracking the missing money. I put on my reading glasses and let my eyes do what they have done for 3 decades. I scanned the routing numbers, the timestamps, the transaction codes, and the destination accounts. It took me less than 5 minutes to find the bleeding artery. There it was, right in the middle of the spreadsheet. A series of systematic wire transfers executed late at night over the past 4 months. The amounts were carefully staggered to avoid triggering automated corporate security alerts. 50,000 here, 80,000 there. But it was not just the sheer volume of the amounts that made my blood run cold. It was the destination. Every single stolen dollar was being routed to a commercial checking account under the name Sunrise Ventures, Trent's shell company, the phantom corporation operating out of my own luxury suburban condo. But the true horror of Chloe's masterpiece was hidden deep in the digital footprint. I pointed to the IP address logged next to the fraudulent transfers. I asked the chief financial officer to trace it immediately. He pulled up the employee network access log. His voice was shaking violently as he told me the transfers were authorized using the administrative login credentials of David Jackson. Furthermore, every single transaction was executed from an external IP address registered to my son's home network. I stared at the glowing computer screen, feeling a suffocating weight pressed down on my chest. Chloe had not just guessed David's corporate passwords. She had waited until my exhausted son fell asleep after working an 80-hour week. She had crept into his home office in the dead of night, logged into his secure corporate portal, and siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars directly into her white lover's bank account. She had meticulously laid down a digital trail of breadcrumbs leading the authorities straight to her sleeping husband. The cruelty of her plan was absolutely staggering in its perfection. When the federal authorities finally closed in, Chloe would play the role of the devastated, naive wife. She would cry real tears in the courtroom and tell the judge she had absolutely no idea her husband was a corporate thief. She would claim David stole the money because he was stressed about paying for his father's mounting medical bills and severe dementia care. The narrative was completely bulletproof. Society loves a tragic story of a loyal wife betrayed by a corrupted man. David would face a minimum of 20 years in a maximum security federal prison. His stellar reputation, his hard-earned career, his entire future would be burned to ashes. Meanwhile, Chloe would quietly file for divorce, play the victim, and slip away to the Bahamas to live like an absolute queen using the money she stole from my house and my son's company. I looked up at the chief financial officer. My voice was dangerously calm, echoing the terrifying silence before a storm. I asked him what the company was planning to do with this digital evidence. He swallowed hard, tugging at his expensive collar. He told me the board of directors had held an emergency meeting that very morning. The evidence against David was simply too overwhelming to ignore. The corporate lawyers had already finalized the compliance reports and handed the entire file over to the federal authorities. I grabbed him by the lapels of his suit, pulling him entirely out of his chair until his face was inches from mine. I demanded to know when the authorities were making their move. He was shaking so badly he could barely form the words. He told me the Financial Crimes Division was preparing the federal arrest warrants as we spoke. They were going to raid the corporate office and David's home on Friday morning. They were coming to put my son in handcuffs to drag him out in front of his entire neighborhood and destroy his life forever. I released his suit jacket, letting him collapse back into his chair, and stepped away from the desk. Today was Wednesday. It was already past 1 p.m. My only son had a massive federal target painted on his back by the woman who shared his bed, and the government was already marching toward his front door. I had exactly 48 hours to reverse a flawless frame job, dismantle a multinational money laundering scheme, and destroy Chloe and Trent before they destroyed my bloodline. I walked out of that corner office without saying another word. The time for gathering evidence in the shadows was over. The game had just shifted from defense to offense, and I was going to wage an absolute war. I walked out of that corporate glass tower with the cold precision of a man who had just mapped out a battlefield. 48 hours. That was all the time I had before federal agents kicked down my son's door and dragged him away in chains for a crime his wife committed. I got back into my truck and locked the doors. My mind was racing, but it was a familiar rhythm. When you spend 30 years taking down organized crime syndicates and corrupt billionaires, you learn that you never walk into a federal raid alone. You need heavy artillery. You need someone who knows how the federal system operates from the inside out. I pulled out my secure phone and dialed a number I knew entirely by heart. It belonged to Marcus, an old friend and a retired Federal Bureau of Investigation special agent. Marcus and I used to run joint task forces back in the early 2000s. He knew how to track dirty money, and he knew how to build a cage that no criminal defense lawyer could ever break. Marcus answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed him at my dining room table in 20 minutes, and that my son was being framed for a multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement by a white-collar amateur. Marcus did not ask any questions. He just told me to put on a pot of dark roast coffee and hung up the phone. Half an hour later, we were sitting in my kitchen with my encrypted laptop open between us. I walked him through every single piece of evidence I had gathered over the past 2 days. The forged power of attorney, the fake medical diagnosis from the actor they hired, the secret audio recordings, the shell company named Sunrise Ventures registered to my own luxury condo, and finally the digital breadcrumbs Chloe had planted on David's work computer to frame him for the missing corporate funds. Marcus leaned back in his chair, crossing his massive arms over his chest. He looked at the glowing screen tracking the pending wire transfers and let out a low whistle. "She is highly ambitious, Leroy. I will give her that," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "She is trying to wash $500,000 in a single week. The $250,000 from your stolen house equity and another $250,000 she siphoned from David's logistics firm. She is staging it all in that Sunrise Ventures account right now." My first instinct was to call the bank and freeze the domestic funds immediately to stop the bleeding. but Marcus shook his head, holding up a hand to stop me. "No, Leroy," he said, leaning forward and pointing at the screen. "You do not stop an arrogant enemy when they are in the middle of making a fatal mistake. If you freeze the domestic accounts right now, she gets spooked. She might find a way to destroy the digital evidence on David's computer before the federal raid on Friday. She might spin a story that she was hacked and play the victim. We do not just want to stop her. We want to completely bury her under federal charges." He was absolutely right. To guarantee a federal indictment for international wire fraud, we needed her to execute the final step of her plan. We needed her to voluntarily push that button and send the stolen $500,000 across international borders. We traced the outgoing routing protocols she had set up on her laptop. She was preparing to wire the entire $500,000 to an offshore account in the Bahamas by Thursday night. She and Trent were planning to hop on a plane right after the money cleared, leaving David to face the federal raid entirely alone on Friday morning. I pulled out my phone and called Graham, my cutthroat private attorney. I told him we were deliberately letting the money cross the border, but we were going to turn the destination account into a digital prison. Graham immediately understood the assignment. He contacted his international banking liaisons and filed a blind injunction known in the financial world as a freeze order. It is a highly classified legal maneuver used in ongoing federal investigations to trap escaping assets. We placed an invisible tripwire over Trent's offshore account in the Bahamas. The mechanics of it were beautifully devastating. The account would remain completely open and active on their end. It would gladly accept incoming wire transfers. But the absolute second the money landed, the entire balance would instantly lock down. They would be able to see the $500,000 sitting right there on their phone screens, but they would not be able to withdraw, transfer, or access a single cent. It was a digital roach motel. The stolen money checks in, but it never checks out. I signed the authorization papers electronically right there at my kitchen table. Marcus and I watched the screen, waiting for the trap to be fully armed by the international authorities. By mid-afternoon, Graham called back to confirm the freeze order was active and completely undetectable. Chloe and her white lover were going to send $500,000 straight into a federal vault, and they would not realize they were completely trapped until it was far too late. I closed my laptop, feeling a dark, heavy satisfaction settling deeply into my bones. The trap was set. Now we just had to wait for the rats to take the blind bait. But Chloe was not just planning to steal the money and run. She was a narcissist, and narcissists always need a grand finale to stroke their own massive egos. As Marcus was packing up his files to leave, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text message from Chloe. I opened it and read the words carefully. My blood turned to absolute ice in my veins. It was a digital invitation to a family anniversary dinner. She was hosting a private gathering at an upscale restaurant downtown on Thursday night, tomorrow night, the exact night before David was scheduled to be arrested by the federal authorities. The message was dripping with her usual fake, sickly sweetness. She wrote that she wanted to celebrate our family and make a very special announcement regarding my future care and well-being. She mentioned that her own parents were flying into town just for the occasion. I stared at the bright screen, seeing right through her sickening words. She was not hosting a dinner to celebrate anything. She was hosting a public execution. She was planning to use this elegant family dinner to unveil the fake medical documents and announce to everyone that I was severely demented. She was going to formally commit me to a nursing home in front of witnesses to solidify her alibi. She wanted to lock me away in a medical prison on Thursday night so that when the authorities came for David on Friday morning, there would be no one left to defend him or pay for his legal representation. She wanted to completely eradicate the Jackson men in 48 hours and raise a glass of expensive champagne with her parents while she did it. Marcus looked over my shoulder and read the message. He let out a dark, humorless laugh. "She is really serving her own head on a silver platter," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "What are you going to do, Leroy?" I looked at the invitation, reading the time and the address of the expensive downtown restaurant. I typed out a brief, polite reply confirming my attendance and hit send. I looked back at Marcus, my eyes cold and entirely focused. "I am going to put on a nice suit," I told him. "I am going to go to this lovely family dinner. And I am going to watch my beautiful daughter-in-law smile and drink her expensive wine right up until the exact moment I burn her perfect little world straight to the ground." I sat alone in my kitchen as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hardwood floor. The trap with the federal authorities and the offshore bank account was perfectly set, but 30 years working in the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS taught me one universal truth about financial predators. If you trap two rats in a cage, they will eventually turn on each other to survive. But I did not want to wait for the federal raid on Friday morning for that to happen. I wanted them to tear each other apart before they even sat down to eat their expensive steaks at the anniversary dinner. I wanted Chloe and Trent to walk into that restaurant already bleeding from self-inflicted wounds. Thieves are naturally paranoid creatures. Their entire relationship is built on a foundation of lies, deceit, and stolen money. There is absolutely no real trust between a woman who betrays her devoted husband and a man who lives in a condo paid for by an elderly man he plans to rob. All I had to do was plant a single seed of doubt, and their natural greed would do the rest of the heavy lifting. I opened my encrypted laptop and went to work. I was going to execute a classic psychological warfare tactic known as the prisoner's dilemma. I was going to convince Trent that his beautiful partner in crime was preparing to throw him completely under the bus. I spent 2 hours carefully crafting a digital dossier. Using my extensive knowledge of banking protocols and legal phrasing, I created a highly convincing chain of documents. The first document was a fabricated email thread designed to look like a leaked internal communication from the offshore bank in the Bahamas. The email showed a formal request supposedly submitted by Chloe earlier that morning. The request explicitly asked the banking executives to remove Trent as a beneficial owner of the Sunrise Ventures account and to transfer sole signatory rights exclusively to her. But I did not stop there. I needed Trent to believe that he was not just losing the money, but that he was also being set up to take the fall for the entire criminal operation. I drafted a fake legal memorandum. I made it look like a draft of an immunity plea deal from a high-priced criminal defense attorney. The document outlined a narrative where Chloe claimed she was emotionally manipulated and physically coerced by Trent into stealing the corporate funds from my son David. It stated that Trent was the sole mastermind behind the fake medical diagnosis and the forged power of attorney. According to this fake document, Chloe was preparing to surrender all the stolen funds to the authorities in exchange for full immunity, leaving Trent to face decades in a federal penitentiary completely alone. It was a masterpiece of digital deception. It looked incredibly authentic because it utilized the exact same cutthroat survival tactics that these types of criminals always use when the walls start closing in. I compiled the documents into a single secure file. I used a masked IP address and an anonymous email server to send the package directly to Trent's personal email account. I added a simple subject line that read, "Urgent security breach regarding Sunrise Ventures." I hit send and leaned back in my chair. Trent was a classic parasite. He drove a flashy sports car and wore custom-tailored suits, but he was living rent-free in a condo that belonged to me and funding his lifestyle with money stolen by a woman. Men like Trent are arrogant, but they are also deeply cowardly. When a coward thinks his safety net is being pulled out from under him, he panics immediately and aggressively. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my headphones. I connected them to the receiver synced to the audio bug I had dropped into Chloe's designer purse earlier that afternoon. I put the headphones on and closed my eyes, letting the audio feed paint a vivid picture in my mind. Chloe was currently at a high-end day salon getting herself pampered for the grand family dinner she was hosting tonight. I could hear the ambient sounds of the salon, the soft, generic pop music playing in the background, the whirring of hair dryers, the polite chatter of women spending hundreds of dollars on manicures and blowouts. Chloe was chatting happily with a stylist about what dress she was going to wear to the restaurant. She sounded completely relaxed, absolutely thrilled with her own perceived brilliance. She truly believed she was untouchable. Then her cell phone rang. It was a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the relaxing atmosphere of the salon. I heard her rummage through her purse to grab the phone. "Hey, baby," she answered, her voice dropping into a low, intimate whisper. "I am just finishing up at the salon. I cannot wait to celebrate tonight. The old man has no idea what is coming for him." There was no sweet reply from the other end. I could hear Trent's voice bleeding through the phone speaker, loud and heavily distorted by pure, unadulterated rage. He was screaming so loudly that Chloe gasped and immediately told the stylist she needed to step outside for a private call. I listened to the rapid clicking of her heels as she practically ran out of the salon and into the cold city street. "Trent, what is wrong with you?" she hissed, her voice tight with sudden anxiety. "Keep your voice down. People are staring at me. Do not tell me to keep my voice down, you lying, manipulative snake," Trent roared through the receiver. "I know exactly what you are doing. You really thought I was just going to sit back and let you lock me out of the Bahamas account. You thought you could just leave me holding the bag for the federal fraud charges while you walk away with full immunity?" Chloe stopped walking, Her breathing became rapid and shallow. "What are you talking about, Trent?" she asked, her voice trembling with genuine confusion. "I did not lock you out of anything. We are partners. We are doing this together just like we planned. Do not play the innocent victim with me," Trent snarled. "I just received a completely leaked dossier from the offshore account manager. I saw the emails, Chloe. I saw the legal drafted plea deal. You are trying to shift the sole signatory rights to yourself, and you are drafting a statement telling the authorities that I forced you to embezzle the money from David's company. You are trying to frame me to save your own miserable skin." I smiled in the quiet of my kitchen. The poison was working perfectly. "Trent, you are insane," Chloe cried out, desperation clawing at her throat. "I never sent any emails to the bank. I never spoke to a defense attorney. Why would I do that? We have the money. We have the fake medical documents. The plan is working perfectly. Someone is messing with you. Someone is trying to set us up." Trent laughed, a bitter, harsh sound that echoed through the hidden microphone. "Your brain-dead husband. Your senile father-in-law who thinks it is 1998. No one else knows about Sunrise Ventures, Chloe. No one else knows about the offshore accounts. You are the only one with the login credentials to request a signatory change. You got greedy. You realized you did not need me anymore and you tried to cut me out." "Trent, I swear to you on my life I did not do this," Chloe pleaded. She was hyperventilating now, her carefully constructed composure completely shattering in the middle of the sidewalk. "You have to believe me. We are so close to the finish line. Do not do anything stupid and ruin this for us." "I am not the one ruining anything," Trent fired back, his voice dripping with venom. "You made a massive mistake, Chloe. You forgot that I have access to the exact same digital trails that you do. If I go down for corporate embezzlement, I am dragging you straight down to hell with me. I will hand the authorities every single text message, every single bank routing number, and every single fake document you procured." "Please, baby, just calm down," Chloe begged, tears clearly forming in her voice. "Let me come to the condo right now. Let me look at these documents. We can figure this out. Just stay there and do not call anyone." "I am not staying at the condo," Trent replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous, chilling frequency. "And we are not figuring this out in private. You are hosting a lovely family dinner tonight, right? A big celebration to lock away your father-in-law." Trent's words hit Chloe like a physical blow. I could hear her gasp, her breath catching sharply in her throat. "Trent, no," she whispered, terrified. "You cannot come to the restaurant. David will be there. My parents will be there. The old man will be there. It will ruin everything. You promised you would stay in the shadows until tomorrow morning. Plans change when people become traitors," Trent said coldly. "I am not waiting in the shadows like a fool while you finalize your little immunity deal. I want to see you face to face. I want to look you in the eyes when you try to explain these documents to me. If you try to run, or if you try to deny me my cut of that money, I will walk right up to your husband and your parents, and I will tell them exactly whose bed you have been sleeping in for the past 3 years. Trent, please do not do this." Chloe sobbed openly now, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. "Save a seat for me at the table," Trent said. "I hear the steaks are excellent." The line went dead with a sharp click. I listened to the sound of Chloe weeping hysterically on the street corner, her perfect world rapidly collapsing into absolute chaos. She was terrified. She had completely lost control of her partner, her plan, and her safety. I reached up and pulled the headphones off my ears, placing them neatly on the kitchen table. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. The alliance was entirely broken. Trent was blinded by paranoia, and Chloe was paralyzed by fear. I stood up and walked toward my bedroom to get ready for the evening. I needed to pick out my best tailored suit. Trent was going to crash the family dinner tonight exactly as I had calculated. The stage was set, the actors were moving to their marks, and the audience was completely oblivious. I was going to walk into that restaurant tonight and watch them burn each other to ashes. I walked into the restaurant. The private dining room of El Etoile was bathed in the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. It was the most exclusive and outrageously expensive French restaurant in the entire city. Reserving this room on a Thursday night cost a minimum of $10,000. I knew exactly how much it cost because the money paying for this extravagant family anniversary dinner had been siphoned directly from my compromised retirement accounts. I stood in the shadows of the hallway just outside the heavy oak doors of the private room. I did not walk in immediately. I waited and I listened. The thick wood muffled the voices slightly, but my hearing was perfectly fine. I could hear the sharp, arrogant voice of Chloe's father, Richard, and the high-pitched, condescending laugh of her mother, Patricia. They had flown in from the coast, supposedly to celebrate family, but their conversation sounded more like a firing squad. I listened as Richard relentlessly berated my son. He told David that a real man should never look so exhausted. He told him that if he was struggling at the logistics firm, he clearly lacked the killer instinct required for corporate leadership. He actually had the nerve to suggest that David was failing to provide Chloe with the lifestyle she deserved. David did not defend himself. My brilliant, hardworking son just sat there taking the verbal abuse, apologizing softly and blaming his recent stress on his massive workload. Then Patricia chimed in. Her voice dripped with fake sympathy that barely concealed her absolute disgust. She told David it must be so incredibly draining to deal with a failing career and a severely demented father at the exact same time. She referred to me as a tragic burden. She told Chloe she was a saint for putting up with my supposed insanity and wandering mind. She said it was time to lock the old man away before he became a complete embarrassment to their social standing. They were feasting on my stolen money while chewing up my son's dignity and spitting it out on the table. I reached down and adjusted the cuffs of my shirt. I was not wearing my faded flannel today. I was not wearing my scuffed work boots. I had gone deep into the back of my closet and pulled out the custom-tailored charcoal gray three-piece suit I used to wear when I testified before federal grand juries. I wore a crisp white shirt, a solid silk tie, and polished leather Oxfords that shined like black glass. I did not slouch. I pulled my shoulders back, lifted my chin, and let 30 years of absolute federal authority settle heavily into my bones. The confused, fragile old man was dead. The senior forensic investigator had officially arrived. I pushed the heavy oak doors open with both hands. They hit the wall with a loud, resounding crack that silenced the entire room instantly. Every single head at the long mahogany table snapped toward the entrance. Richard froze with a glass of expensive vintage wine halfway to his mouth. Patricia dropped her silver salad fork onto her porcelain plate with a sharp clatter. David looked up, his exhausted eyes widening in absolute shock as he took in my appearance. But Chloe's reaction was the absolute best of all. The smug, triumphant smile melted off her face so fast it looked like she had been physically slapped. All the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost in a designer dress. She was staring at a man she fully believed was suffering from severe dementia, but the man standing in the doorway looked like he was about to initiate a hostile corporate takeover. "Good evening, family," I said, my voice a deep, booming rumble that commanded absolute attention. I apologize for my slight delay. I was busy reviewing some highly complex financial portfolios. I walked into the room with heavy, deliberate strides. I did not shuffle. I did not look confused. I walked straight to the head of the table, pulled out the heavy velvet chair, and sat down with perfect posture. The silence in the room was so thick it felt like you could choke on it. "Dad," David stammered, leaning forward in his chair. You look incredible. You look like you did 10 years ago." "Thank you, son," I replied, looking him dead in the eyes. A man should always dress his absolute best when he is preparing to settle his accounts. Richard cleared his throat, puffing out his chest, trying to regain the arrogant authority he had just been projecting. "Well, Leroy," he said, using a slow, patronizing tone as if he were speaking to a toddler. "We are certainly surprised to see you looking so sharp. Chloe told us you have been having some very bad days lately. She said your mind wanders and you forget what decade you are living in." I turned my head slowly and locked my eyes directly onto Richard. My gaze was so cold and penetrating that he visibly flinched and shifted his weight in his chair. "My mind is perfectly fine, Richard," I said, speaking with crisp, terrifying articulation. "In fact, my memory is completely flawless. I remember exact dates. I remember specific bank routing numbers. I even remember the precise locations of certain offshore shell companies. It is truly amazing what a man can recall when he actually pays attention to the details." Chloe let out a sudden sharp gasp. Her hand flew to her throat and she knocked over her crystal water glass. The water spilled across the pristine white tablecloth, soaking into the fabric like a dark, spreading stain. "Oh, look at that, Chloe," I said, giving her a chilling smile. "You are making an absolute mess. You should really be more careful with your surroundings." Patricia nervously patted her perfectly styled hair, looking frantically between me and her daughter. Well, she laughed a high, nervous sound. "It is wonderful that you are having a lucid moment, Leroy. Dementia is such a tricky, tragic disease. One minute you are perfectly fine, and the next minute you are completely lost. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table and steepling my fingers. "I am not lost, Patricia," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I know exactly where I am. I am sitting in a $10,000 room eating imported food that is being paid for by a massive ongoing financial fraud. I know exactly who is sitting at this table, and I know exactly what everyone in this room has done." David looked at me in total confusion. "Dad, what are you talking about? What financial fraud?" Chloe jumped up from her chair so fast it tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. Her chest was heaving and her eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. She knew I was baiting her. She knew I was tearing down her entire narrative piece by piece, and she needed to execute her final move before I exposed her completely. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice shrill and desperate. "David, do not listen to him. He is having a severe psychotic break. The doctor warned us this would happen. He is delusional. He is paranoid." She reached with trembling hands for her expensive champagne glass, raising it high in the air. She looked around the room, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace of pure terror. "Everyone, please," she cried out, her voice shaking violently. "This is exactly why I brought us all here tonight. This breaks my heart, but we have to face reality. Leroy is completely sick. He is a danger to himself and to this family. I have the medical documents signed by a licensed physician. Tomorrow morning we are officially transferring Leroy to the Sunny Pines Secure Medical Facility, where he can get the psychiatric lockdown care he desperately needs." She raised her glass higher, preparing to deliver the final nail in my coffin. She opened her mouth to make a toast to my absolute destruction, but she never got to finish her sentence. Before another word could leave her lying lips, the heavy oak doors of the private dining room were violently kicked open. The loud explosive crash echoed like a gunshot through the elegant restaurant. Everyone at the table jumped in terror. I slowly turned my head, keeping my posture completely relaxed. Trent stood in the doorway. He was not wearing his sleek, tailored suit. He looked like he had just crawled out of a war zone. His hair was a wild, messy tangle. His expensive shirt was wrinkled and completely soaked in sweat. His face was bright red, and his eyes were bulging with a manic, terrifying rage. He looked like a cornered animal that had finally snapped. He locked his wild, furious eyes directly onto Chloe. "You lying, treacherous thief!" Trent roared, his voice tearing through the restaurant like a chainsaw. "You really thought you could lock me out of the Bahamas account and leave me to take the federal fall?" Chloe dropped her champagne glass. It shattered into 100 sparkling pieces on the hardwood floor. The grand finale she had planned had just been hijacked, and the true execution was about to begin. The entire room froze in a state of absolute shock. Trent was standing in the doorway, radiating pure violence. His chest heaved, and his fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He prepared to march toward the table and tear Chloe apart right there in front of her entire family. But before Trent could take a single step forward, a man dressed in a pristine black tuxedo stepped smoothly past him. It was the restaurant general manager. He completely ignored the wild-looking man sweating in the doorway. He carried a small black leather booklet, holding it tightly against his chest. He possessed the rigid professional posture of a man who dealt with high society crises on a nightly basis. The manager walked directly toward the head of the table, effectively halting Trent in his tracks. The sudden shift in the atmosphere was incredibly jarring. The threat of physical violence was temporarily suspended by the suffocating weight of an awkward social reality. The manager stopped right next to Chloe. He bowed his head slightly, his face completely devoid of any emotion. "I apologize for the sudden interruption, madam," the manager said, his voice soft but clear enough for everyone at the table to hear. "I'm afraid there seems to be a significant issue with the payment method you provided to secure this private room tonight." Chloe blinked rapidly. The sheer terror of seeing Trent in the doorway collided violently with the embarrassment of being confronted by restaurant staff. Her panic shifted for a fraction of a second into pure defensive arrogance. She snapped at the manager, demanding to know what he was talking about. She proudly stated that she had put a premium platinum credit card on file when she booked the $10,000 dinner. "Yes, madam," the manager replied, his tone remaining perfectly level. "The card is on file." But the transaction was just completely declined by the issuing bank. The system is showing a hard lock on the account. I sat back in my velvet chair and watched her face turn a bright, blotchy red. I knew exactly why that card was declined. It was one of the fraudulent credit cards she had illegally opened using my stolen identity. She had planned to pay for this extravagant celebration using my own stolen credit. But she did not know that exactly 1 hour ago, my attorney Graham had contacted the Federal Fraud Department. We had placed a hard freeze on every single credit line tied to my Social Security number. Her stolen plastic was now completely worthless. Chloe let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh. She looked at her parents and then back to the manager, waving her hand dismissively. It must be a simple security hold, she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. Sometimes the bank flags large restaurant charges when I am dining out. It is just a fraud prevention measure. She reached down with shaking hands and grabbed her expensive designer purse. She frantically dug through the contents, pulling out her sleek leather wallet. She extracted another premium credit card and shoved it aggressively toward the manager. "Just run this one instead," she ordered him, trying to regain her authority. "And please do it quickly. We are in the middle of a very private family discussion." The manager took the second card with a polite nod and silently walked out of the room. Trent remained standing in the doorway, watching the entire pathetic scene unfold. The furious rage in his eyes began to mix with a creeping sense of dread. He was watching his partner in crime scramble to pay for a dinner. He was slowly realizing that Chloe was losing control of her stolen money too. The heavy oak doors swung open 2 minutes later. The manager returned. His professional mask remained firmly in place, but the tension in the room skyrocketed. He walked back to Chloe and placed the second credit card on the white tablecloth right next to her spilled water glass. "I am terribly sorry, Madam the manager," said his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "That card has also been entirely declined. The terminal indicated that the account has been flagged and frozen by the issuing institution. I must ask you to provide a valid form of payment immediately, or I will have to ask your entire party to vacate the premises." All the remaining color drained from Chloe's face. She looked down at the plastic card sitting on the table as if it were a venomous snake. She started stammering, making wild excuses about bank errors and system failures. She was breathing heavily, completely trapped between the federal fraud lock on her stolen cards and the angry lover waiting in the doorway. That was when her parents decided to intervene. But they did not offer to help their daughter. They did not reach for their own wallets to cover the bill. People like Richard and Patricia do not spend their own money when they can easily blame someone else. Richard turned his head slowly and locked his cold, arrogant eyes directly onto my son, David. Richard sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "What kind of a man are you? You sit there looking like a beaten dog while your wife suffers the ultimate humiliation of having her cards declined in a public restaurant." Patricia shook her head in sheer disgust. "It is absolutely pathetic," she added, crossing her arms over her chest. "We fly all the way here to support your family, and you cannot even afford to buy us a decent meal. You are supposed to be a corporate executive, David, but you are clearly failing at your job, and you are failing our daughter." David shrank into his chair. He looked completely shattered. He was already carrying the massive, crushing weight of a federal corporate embezzlement investigation on his shoulders. He was terrified that he was going to prison in the morning, and now his in-laws were publicly degrading his manhood and his ability to provide. He looked down at his hands, unable to defend himself against their venomous words. He believed he was a failure. He believed his life was entirely over. I could not let that stand. I had let them insult me. I had let them steal from me. But nobody gets to break my son's spirit right in front of my face. I slowly reached inside the breast pocket of my custom-tailored suit. The room was still filled with the harsh sounds of Richard berating David and Chloe, frantically clicking through the banking apps on her phone. I ignored all of them. I pulled out my wallet and extracted a very specific piece of metal. It was not a normal credit card. It was thick, heavy, and completely black. It was a Centurion card, an invite-only card reserved exclusively for individuals with massive verified liquid wealth. It was the card I used when I needed to move significant amounts of money without raising any banking alarms. I held the heavy black metal between my fingers, feeling its cold weight. I leaned forward and tossed the black card onto the center of the table. It landed on the pristine white tablecloth with a heavy, solid thud that instantly silenced Richard mid-sentence. Every eye in the room dropped to the table. Richard stared at the black card, his jaw falling open in absolute disbelief. Patricia gasped, recognizing the exclusive symbol of wealth immediately. Trent narrowed his eyes from the doorway, totally confused by the display of extreme financial power coming from an old man he thought was a clueless victim. I looked up at the restaurant manager, who was staring respectfully at the heavy metal card. Please take that card and cover the entire balance for tonight, I told the manager, my voice echoing with absolute, undisputed authority. Add a generous 20% gratuity for your incredible patience. The manager bowed deeply, picking up the black card with extreme care. Right away, sir, he said, turning to leave the room. Chloe stared at me, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization. She looked at the heavy black card and then she looked at my face. She tried to speak, but she could barely form the words. Where did you get that? She whispered, her voice cracking with pure terror. How do you have that kind of account? I leaned back in my velvet chair and adjusted my silk tie. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and delivered the final crushing blow to her pathetic financial illusion. It is very simple, Chloe, I said, my voice cold and sharp like a razor blade. I am paying for this dinner because I am the only one at this table with any real money, and I had to step in because, quite frankly, every single credit card you just handed to that manager has my name on it anyway. I sat back in my velvet chair and watched her face turn a bright blotchy red. I knew exactly why that card was declined. It was one of the fraudulent credit cards she had illegally opened using my stolen identity. She had planned to pay for this extravagant celebration using my own stolen credit. But she did not know that exactly 1 hour ago, my attorney Graham had contacted the Federal Fraud Department. We had placed a hard freeze on every single credit line tied to my Social Security number. Her stolen plastic was now completely worthless. Chloe stared at the space where the heavy black card had been resting just seconds ago. Her mind was visibly fracturing under the weight of the reality crashing down on her. She looked at her parents, and then she looked at David. She forced a wet, trembling laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest. "Dad," she stammered, her voice pitching high and shrill, echoing off the expensive wallpaper. "What are you talking about? You are not making any in the air. The dementia is completely in the air. The dementia is completely taking over his brain. He is hallucinating all of this. He probably stole that credit card from somewhere or found a fake one online. David, we need to call the medical transport right now. He is having a total psychotic break." Richard and Patricia eagerly grabbed onto her pathetic lifeline. They were desperate to maintain their illusion of superiority. "Yes," Richard said, puffing his chest out and fixing his suit jacket. "This is clearly the raving of a sick, delusional old man. David, you need to control your father immediately. This is highly embarrassing for our family." David looked between me and Chloe, completely paralyzed by the escalating chaos. His exhausted mind could not process what was happening. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True authority does not shout. I reached down to the heavy leather briefcase I had rested against the leg of my chair. I lifted it smoothly, placing it squarely on the pristine white tablecloth. The brass latches snapped open with a sound like a chambering bullet. I reached inside and pulled out a massive stack of bound legal documents. It was nearly 4 inches thick, heavily tabbed and stamped with red confidential markers. I lifted the massive stack and slammed it down onto the center of the table. The heavy thud rattled the silver cutlery and made Patricia's crystal wine glass completely tip over, spilling expensive red wine across the table like blood. "I am not hallucinating, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "And this is not a medical episode. This is a highly detailed, certified forensic audit." Chloe stared at the thick stack of papers, her breath hitching violently in her throat. "You see, Chloe?" I continued, leaning forward and interlocking my fingers over the file. "You made a very fundamental mistake. You assume that because I wear a faded flannel shirt and drive a beat-up old truck that I am just a clueless old man waiting to die. You looked at my skin color, my age, and my quiet demeanor, and you built an entire criminal narrative based on your own pathetic, ignorant prejudices. You thought I was easy prey." I let my cold eyes sweep across the faces of Richard and Patricia, making sure they absorbed every single word. I watched their arrogant expressions begin to falter and crack. I did not spend my life laying bricks or sweeping floors. I told them, my voice resonating with absolute power. I spent 30 years working for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I was a senior forensic accountant for the federal government. I spent 3 decades hunting down Wall Street billionaires, corrupt hedge fund managers, and international money launderers. I have dismantled offshore tax havens that would make your arrogant heads spin. I put powerful men in federal prison who had teams of Harvard-trained lawyers. I trace hidden money for a living. Chloe's face went completely blank. Her entire body began to tremble so violently the table shook. The realization was finally hitting her like a speeding freight train. She had not targeted a helpless victim. She had targeted an apex federal predator. Did you really think I said tapping my index finger against the heavy stack of documents that a few cheap forged signatures on a general power of attorney document could get past me? Did you honestly believe that using a laser printer to copy my signature was a stroke of criminal genius? Did you think hiring a 2-bit actor to play a doctor in my living room and paying him a cash bribe was going to stay a secret? I opened the thick file and flipped to the first tab. I slid a high-resolution photograph across the polished wood table. It was a clear, crisp picture of Chloe handing the thick envelope of cash to the fake doctor in my living room, pulled directly from my hidden button camera. David looked down at the photograph. His breath caught sharply in his throat. He looked at his wife, his expression twisting from exhaustion into absolute horror. "Chloe," he whispered, his voice breaking into pieces. "What is this? What did you do to my father?" Chloe could not look at him. She was hyperventilating, staring at the photograph as if it were a literal death warrant. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a pathetic squeak came out. "But that is just amateur hour, Chloe," I continued, my voice relentless and entirely cold. "The real comedy of your little operation is your financial routing strategy. You actually thought you could illegally mortgage my fully paid-off house for $250,000 and hide the stolen money in a completely transparent limited liability company. You thought you could siphon another $250,000 from my son's corporate logistics firm using his personal IP address and leave him to take the fall for your federal crimes." David let out a choked gasp, grabbing the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. He finally understood why his company was bleeding money and why the digital trail was pointing directly at him. The woman he loved was actively setting him up for 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I leaned back in my chair and prepared to deliver the absolute killing blow to her entire pathetic empire. "You thought you could wash $500,000 through a fake corporation called Sunrise Ventures," I said, my voice echoing through the silent room. "And you were arrogant enough to register that shell company to a luxury suburban condo that I personally own and trusted you to manage." The name echoed heavily in the dead silence of the private dining room. Sunrise Ventures. I did not even have to look at the doorway to know exactly what was about to happen next. I had perfectly timed this entire confrontation. Trent, who had been standing frozen in the entrance watching the entire catastrophic scene unfold, suddenly snapped. The moment the name of his secret offshore shell company left my lips, his face twisted into a mask of pure homicidal fury. His entire body went rigid. He realized in a fraction of a second that the anonymous leaked documents he received earlier today were absolutely real. He realized that the entire criminal operation was entirely blown, and that Chloe had led him straight into a federal trap. He stepped violently into the dining room, kicking a heavy wooden chair completely out of his way. The sharp crack of wood hitting the floor made Patricia scream. Trent pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at Chloe's pale, terrified face, ignoring everyone else in the room. "You lying, scheming piece of trash!" Trent roared, his voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers like a physical blow. "You told me this old man was a brain-dead, illiterate fool. You told me he could not even read his own mail." Trent took another aggressive step forward, his eyes blazing with a madness born of pure panic. He looked at me sitting calmly at the head of the table, surrounded by forensic evidence, and then he glared back at his secret lover. "He is a federal agent, you stupid, arrogant woman," Trent screamed, his voice breaking with sheer terror. "You brought a federal financial investigator right to our front door. You set me up." Chloe scrambled backward in her chair, pressing herself against the wall, trying to escape the wrath of the man she had been sleeping with behind my son's back. The pristine family dinner had officially collapsed into a chaotic nightmare of betrayal and crime, and I sat there watching the entire beautiful disaster unfold exactly as I had planned. Trent was still standing over the table, breathing heavily like a cornered animal. Chloe was pressing herself into the expensive restaurant wallpaper, desperately trying to melt into the architecture and disappear. David was looking frantically between his wife and the unkempt man in the doorway, his exhausted mind finally connecting the horrific dots of his broken marriage. I did not let the chaotic silence reign for more than a few seconds. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small black digital audio recorder. I placed it gently on the pristine white tablecloth right next to the massive stack of forensic evidence. The heavy clatter of the device hitting the solid wood table drew everyone's attention back to me. I looked at my son. My heart ached for him, but I knew the only way to heal a deeply infected wound is to cut it completely open and expose it to the light. I told David that I knew he was absolutely exhausted. I told him he had been blaming himself for the missing money at his corporate logistics firm and carrying the heavy weight of a failing marriage on his own shoulders. I wanted him to hear exactly what the woman he loved thought about his fierce loyalty and his hard work. I pressed the play button on the small device and turned the volume all the way up so it would echo off the crystal chandeliers. The crisp, high-definition audio filled the private dining room. It was the exact recording I had captured when I dropped the microbug into Chloe's designer purse right after she paid off the fake doctor in my living room. Chloe's voice echoed through the restaurant crystal clear and completely undeniably hers. We all sat in absolute silence and listened to her laughing with Trent in the front seat of her luxury car. We heard her bragging about tricking me into a fake medical diagnosis. And then came the part that froze the blood in David's veins. Chloe enthusiastically explained her master plan to her secret lover. She detailed exactly how she had crept into David's home office in the dead of night and routed the stolen corporate funds from his work computer while he was asleep. She gloated about how the federal regulators would trace the IP address and arrest him by Friday morning. She explicitly stated that David would spend 20 years in a maximum security prison for embezzlement, giving her the perfect excuse to file for divorce and run off to the Bahamas with my stolen retirement money and his corporate funds. The recording ended with a sharp click. The silence that followed was heavier than a concrete vault. Chloe was weeping openly now, but they were tears of pure, selfish panic, not remorse. She knew her perfect life was entirely over. Trent took a slow step backward, realizing how deeply implicated he was on that federal tape. I watched my son's face. I watched a good, honest man completely break down. The exhaustion in his eyes was replaced by a profound, devastating grief that quickly hardened into pure, unadulterated rage. He looked at the woman he had promised to protect and cherish. He looked at the mother of his future children if they ever had any. He saw the absolute monster lurking beneath her expensive makeup and designer clothes. She was not just stealing his money. She was actively preparing to send him to a federal penitentiary to be locked in a cage for 2 decades just so she could fund a tropical vacation with another man. Something inside David finally snapped. The quiet, hard-working corporate executive completely vanished. With a guttural roar of pure agony, David lunged across the long mahogany table. He crashed through the expensive crystal glasses and the silver centerpieces, sending plates shattering loudly to the hardwood floor. He tackled Trent, slamming the taller man directly into the heavy oak doors. Trent choked and gasped as David's hands locked around his throat. They hit the floor in a violent tangle of limbs. David was screaming, demanding to know how they could do this to him after everything he had sacrificed. Richard and Patricia were shrieking in terror, backing away into the corner of the room, trying to escape the violence. I did not panic. I stood up slowly from my velvet chair. I walked over to where my son was pinning Trent to the floor. I reached down and placed a firm, heavy hand on David's shoulder. My grip was absolute. I spoke with the calm, undeniable authority of a father who has completely taken control of the battlefield. Do not dirty your hands with this absolute trash, son. I told him, my voice steady and deeply grounding. Do not throw your life away for a man who is not even worth the dirt on your boots. David looked up at me, his eyes wide and wild with betrayed fury. His hands were trembling violently around Trent's neck. I squeezed his shoulder tighter, pulling him slightly back. Let him breathe, David, I commanded. I told him to stand up and fix his tie. I reminded him that he was a Jackson, and Jacksons do not lose their composure over common criminals. I told him that everything was already perfectly arranged, and that he did not need to break a single sweat to destroy them because I had already built the cage. David breathed heavily, his chest heaving as he stared down at the pathetic, gasping man beneath him. Slowly, the primal rage faded from his eyes, leaving behind a cold, hardened resolve. He released his tight grip and stood up, brushing the dust off his suit jacket. Trent scrambled backward, coughing violently and clutching his bruised throat. He crawled on his hands and knees, trying to put as much distance between himself and my son as possible. David walked back to my side, standing tall and finally seeing the entire room with absolute clarity. With the physical violence diffused, Richard and Patricia realized they were losing the only leverage they had. They immediately shifted into defensive aggression. Richard puffed out his chest, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at the digital audio recorder sitting on the table. He started screaming that the audio recording was completely illegal. He yelled that I had violated his daughter's privacy and that any court in the country would throw out a secret wiretap. Patricia joined in, shrieking that I was a manipulative monster who had illegally spied on my own family. She yelled that they were going to call the police and have me arrested for illegal surveillance and have David arrested for assault. They were desperately trying to build a legal shield around their corrupted daughter, using their wealthy privilege to intimidate me. I let them scream. I let them exhaust their pathetic outrage. When they finally ran out of breath and stood there panting in the ruined dining room, I slowly turned my head and looked at both of them. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the terrifying smile of a seasoned federal predator who had just locked the cage door from the outside. "You are talking about privacy laws, Richard," I asked, my voice dropping to a chilling conversational whisper. "You are standing in a room full of federal evidence, and you are lecturing a former IRS forensic investigator about the admissibility of an audio recording. That is incredibly brave of you." I took a slow step toward the corner where they were cowering. "But if I were you, Richard, I would stop worrying about defending your daughter right now." I leaned forward, resting my hands on my silver cane. "Because quite frankly, you and your wife should really be worrying about yourselves." Richard stared at me, his face flushing with a mix of indignation and uncertainty. He tried to maintain his posture of superiority, but the foundation of his arrogance was visibly crumbling. He told me I was out of my mind. He declared that he and his wife had absolutely nothing to do with Chloe's domestic disputes or her financial decisions. He arrogantly stated that his family wealth was protected by teams of highly paid corporate lawyers, and that an old retired government employee could never touch him. He told me I was just trying to scare them with empty threats because I was bitter and old. I did not raise my voice to match his panic. I just looked at him with a deep, overwhelming sense of pity. It is truly remarkable how people who inherit wealth always believe they are untouchable. They live in a bubble of privilege, completely unaware of how brutal the real world can be when the federal government decides to turn its massive eye in their direction. "Richard the Fur," said, my voice smooth and perfectly steady, "you clearly do not understand how federal asset forfeiture actually works. When my son David was talking about missing funds at his logistics firm earlier tonight, you called him weak. You called him a failure. You said he lacked the killer instinct to provide for your daughter." I took a slow step forward, closing the distance between us. "The truth is, Richard, your daughter was the one with the killer instinct. She was siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from his company. But moving that much stolen cash quickly is a very complicated process. The shell company she set up with her lover, Trent Sunrise Ventures, was a new entity. It had no financial history. Banks put holds on massive wire transfers to new accounts. Chloe was getting impatient, and she was getting incredibly sloppy. Patricia's eyes darted back and forth between me and her husband. She clutched her expensive pearl necklace, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "What does any of this have to do with us?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "We live 3 states away. We have our own money." "You have your own money, Patricia," I agreed, nodding slowly. "But you see, Chloe needed a bridge. She needed an established bank account with a long history of high-value transactions to wash a portion of the stolen corporate funds before she could safely move them offshore. She needed an account that the federal regulators would not immediately flag as suspicious." I turned my attention back to Richard, who was now sweating profusely under the harsh crystal lights of the dining room. "2 weeks ago, Richard, your daughter wired $75,000 directly into your primary wealth management account," I said, watching his face completely drain of color. "I have the transaction logs right here in my forensic file. She routed the stolen corporate money right into the same account you used to pay your country club fees and fund your lavish lifestyle. I imagine she told you it was a gift, or perhaps a return on a previous investment. And because you are a greedy man who worships money, you took it without asking a single question." Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Chloe, who was still cowering against the wall. She could not meet his eyes. She stared at the floor, confirming everything I was saying without speaking a single word. "You took stolen corporate funds," Richard continued, my voice rising slightly to fill the silent room. "You took money that was embezzled by your daughter and framed on my son. And in the eyes of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, that makes your entire wealth management account a receptacle for illicit funds." I pointed a firm finger at his chest. In forensic accounting, we call it commingling funds. The second that dirty $75,000 touched your clean money, your entire financial portfolio became a crime scene. Richard took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the wall. "No," he whispered, shaking his head frantically. "No, that is not possible. My lawyers will fix this. I will just return the $75,000. I did not know it was stolen." "You cannot return it, Richard," I said, delivering the absolute final blow, "because you no longer have access to it. When I filed the federal freeze order on the offshore accounts in the Bahamas this afternoon, I also provided the authorities with the routing numbers to your domestic wealth management accounts. Take out your phone, Richard," I commanded. "Open your premium banking application right now. Look at the money you love so much." Richard frantically dug into his tailored suit pants. His hands were shaking so violently he almost dropped his expensive smartphone on the hardwood floor. He typed in his password. Patricia crowded next to him, looking over his shoulder. I watched their faces as the screen loaded. I did not need to see the phone to know exactly what was displaying on it. I knew they were staring at a bright red screen. I knew they were reading a stark automated message informing them that their accounts had been frozen by a federal mandate and that they needed to contact the authorities immediately. Patricia let out a horrifying guttural scream. It was not a scream of sadness. It was the agonizing shriek of a woman who had just lost her entire identity. All of her millions, her properties, her investments, her social standing erased by a single block of federal code. They were completely and utterly broke. The illusion of their perfect, loyal family instantly evaporated. The arrogant, wealthy parents who had just spent the entire evening lecturing my son about loyalty and provision completely turned on their own flesh and blood. Richard shoved his phone into his pocket and lunged toward his daughter. He did not look at her with love. He looked at her like she was a parasite that had just destroyed his entire life. "You stupid, careless child," he roared, his face twisting in absolute disgust. "You ruined us. You brought a federal investigation into my house. You infected my accounts with your dirty amateur theft." "Dad, please," Chloe sobbed, raising her hands to protect her face. "I did not know they would trace it to you. I was just trying to hide the money temporarily. I was going to pay you back." Patricia stepped forward, pushing her husband aside and getting right in Chloe's face. Her maternal facade was entirely gone, replaced by pure venomous hatred. "Do not call him Dad," Patricia spat, her voice echoing with sheer malice. "You are no daughter of ours. We gave you everything. We bought you the best education, the best clothes, the best life, and you throw it all away for some cheap affair and a clumsy robbery. You dragged our family name through the mud, and you lost all of our money. You are completely on your own. Do not ever call us again." The hypocrisy was absolutely breathtaking. They were furious at her, not because she had betrayed her husband or tried to lock an innocent old man in a psychiatric ward. They were furious because she had accidentally cost them their wealth. They had taught her that money was the only thing that mattered in this world, and now they were abandoning her because she had lost theirs. Chloe stood completely alone. She looked at Trent, who was still cowering on the floor, nursing his bruised throat and refusing to make eye contact with her. She looked at David, who was standing tall next to me, his face a mask of cold, impenetrable stone. She looked at her parents, who had physically turned their backs on her. Her entire support system, her wealth, her lovers, her freedom, everything had been completely vaporized in less than 20 minutes. The perfect life she had so meticulously stolen was gone. She was backed into a corner with absolutely nothing left to lose. I watched the final string of her sanity completely snap. The smug, elegant daughter-in-law vanished entirely. Her eyes widened into a manic, terrifying glare. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She let out a sound that was not human. It was the feral, primal scream of a cornered predator realizing it is about to be put down. Chloe spun around and dropped to her knees next to the ruined dining table. Her manic eyes locked onto the scattered silverware resting among the broken crystal and spilled wine. Her hand shot out and her fingers closed tightly around the heavy silver handle of a serrated steak knife. She stood up so fast her chair went flying across the room. She raised the sharp serrated blade high above her head, gripping it with both hands. Her expensive beige dress was stained with wine and her perfectly styled hair was a wild, frantic mess. "You ruined my life, you bastard old man," she shrieked, her voice tearing through her own vocal cords. "I am going to kill you." With a terrifying roar, she lunged straight across the ruined room, sprinting directly at my chest with the knife raised to strike. Chloe was sprinting directly at my chest with the serrated steak knife raised high above her head. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure feral desperation. She had lost her money, she had lost her secret lover, she had lost her parents, and now she was losing her mind. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. When you spend 30 years interviewing cornered financial criminals, you learn that their final acts of violence are always born of absolute cowardice. I braced my legs, prepared to grab her wrist and disarm her, but I never had to lift a single finger to defend myself. A dark blur moved aggressively across my peripheral vision. It was David. My son moved with a speed and a ferocity born of pure, unconditional protective instinct. He did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He threw his entire body directly into the path of the swinging blade. He did not try to strike his wife. He simply placed himself like a solid concrete wall between the weapon and his father. The sharp, serrated edge of the heavy steak knife caught David across his left forearm. The blade tore viciously through the expensive fabric of his tailored suit jacket and sliced deep into his flesh. A sharp, sickening sound of tearing fabric and breaking skin echoed in the dead silence of the private dining room. The bright crimson flash of blood instantly bloomed across his sleeve, dripping down his wrist and splashing onto the polished hardwood floor. David let out a low, guttural grunt of intense pain, but he did not fall. He stood like an absolute fortress, shielding me completely with his own body. He looked down at his bleeding arm, and then he looked up at the woman he had loved and supported with his entire heart. His eyes were completely empty of any remaining love or sympathy. He was looking at a total stranger. Chloe froze completely. The manic feral energy instantly evaporated from her eyes, replaced by the horrifying cold reality of what she had just done. She looked at the blood dripping from her husband's arm, and her mouth opened in a silent scream of absolute terror. Her fingers went limp, and she dropped the bloody knife. It clattered loudly against the floorboards, breaking the spell of violence. She stumbled backward, her hands covering her face, shaking her head in complete denial. She had crossed the final undeniable boundary. She had transitioned from a white-collar fraudster to a violent criminal in a matter of seconds. Richard and Patricia were screaming in the corner of the room, pressing themselves against the expensive wallpaper. They were completely useless and terrified by the sight of real physical blood. They had spent their entire lives hiding behind their bank accounts, and now they were witnessing the brutal reality of their daughter's corrupted soul. I reached out immediately and gripped David's shoulder, pulling him slightly behind me. I grabbed a clean white cloth napkin from the table and pressed it firmly against his bleeding arm. I applied heavy pressure to stop the bleeding. David was breathing heavily, but he stood tall, his jaw clenched in quiet dignity. I told him he was a good man, and that the bleeding would stop soon. In the heavy, suffocating silence that followed the brutal attack, a sudden, sharp electronic sound pierced the air. It was a cell phone ringing. The sound came from the floor near the doorway where Trent was still crouching. He fumbled nervously in his jacket pocket, pulling out his expensive smartphone. His hands were shaking so violently he almost dropped the device. He looked at the glowing screen and his face turned the color of wet ash. He answered the call, pressing the phone tightly to his ear. I knew exactly who was calling him, and I knew exactly what the automated voice on the other end of the line was saying. It was the federal alert system triggered by the offshore bank in the Bahamas. The freeze order Marcus and I had implemented had officially executed its final aggressive protocol. The stolen money was not just locked anymore. The federal authorities had officially seized the entire $500,000. The account balance was absolute zero. The money was completely gone. Trent slowly lowered the phone from his ear. The device slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered against the wooden floorboards. He looked up at Chloe with a hatred so pure and toxic it practically burned the oxygen in the room. He finally realized that he had lost absolutely everything. He was facing decades in a federal penitentiary for a woman who could not even successfully steal a dime without leaving a massive trail of evidence. With a sudden explosive burst of violent energy, Trent lunged forward across the room. He did not go for me, and he did not go for David. He went straight for the woman who had dragged him into this federal nightmare. He swung his right arm back and slapped Chloe across the face with the full, devastating force of his shattered, greedy ego. The physical impact was brutally loud. Chloe screamed a sharp, agonizing cry of pain and shock. The force of the blow sent her spinning backward. She crashed hard into the remains of the dining table, tangling in the white tablecloth and collapsing onto the floor. She landed heavily among the broken crystal glasses and the spilled red wine. Her expensive designer dress was ruined, covered in stains that looked exactly like the blood she had just drawn from her husband. "You lying, stupid scammer," Trent roared, standing over her broken body. His voice was raw and tearing with panic. "You ruined my entire life. You lost all the money. The federal agents took everything. You told me this was a flawless plan and you led me straight into a massive government trap. You are a complete fraud." Chloe lay on the floor, weeping hysterically, surrounded by the literal wreckage of her own arrogance. She reached out her hand, begging Trent to help her up, but he kicked a broken chair out of his way and backed away from her in absolute disgust. He was pacing like a madman, pulling his hair out, realizing there was nowhere left to run. His passport was useless. His bank accounts were seized. His freedom was entirely over. Richard and Patricia watched their daughter sobbing on the floor among the broken glass, and they did absolutely nothing to help her. They just stood in the corner, shaking with fear, worrying only about their own frozen assets and their ruined social reputation. I stood calmly next to my son, keeping the heavy pressure on his wounded arm, completely unfazed by the chaotic destruction unfolding in front of me. I had audited their lives, and the final balance was absolute zero. Then we all heard it. It was faint at first, sounding like a distant echo in the city streets, but it was growing rapidly louder and more aggressive by the second. The heavy, piercing wail of approaching sirens cutting cleanly through the cold night air. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect violently against the large glass windows of the elegant restaurant. The federal agents had officially arrived to collect their debts. The four federal agents walked into the four federal agents, 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 walked into four federal agents, walked into the elegant space wearing dark tactical jackets with the letters FBI printed in bright yellow across their chests. They were accompanied by two uniformed city police officers whose heavy utility belts clattered against the dead silence of the room. My old friend Marcus, the retired special agent, walked in right behind them, giving me a brief, silent nod of absolute confirmation. The restaurant manager wisely stepped out of their way. This was no longer a high society dispute over a declined credit card. This was a highly coordinated federal raid. Chloe saw the federal agents and her survival instinct immediately kicked in. Despite the massive mountain of forensic evidence sitting on the table and the blood dripping from her husband's arm, her pathological arrogance tried to survive. She actually thought they were there for my son. She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at David. "Officers," she cried out, her voice dripping with fake panic and manufactured tears. "He is the one you are looking for. He embezzled the money from his corporate logistics firm. He is the thief. I had absolutely nothing to do with his corporate crimes. Please take him away before he hurts anyone else." The lead federal agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair, did not even look at David. He pulled a thick, folded document from his jacket pocket. He looked directly at the woman in the wine-stained dress. He did not ask her any questions. "Chloe Jackson," he said, his voice loud and entirely devoid of any sympathy. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of international wire fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit federal medical fraud." Chloe froze, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. She looked at Trent, who was already being forcefully pushed against the expensive floral wallpaper by two federal agents. They kicked his legs apart and violently wrenched his arms behind his back. "This is a mistake," Chloe stammered, taking a stumbling step backward. "I did not do any of that. You have the wrong person. My husband is the criminal." The lead agent stepped forward and grabbed her wrists, pulling them forcefully behind her back. "We do not have the wrong person," he stated coldly. "We picked up your hired actor, Dr. Evans, at his cheap motel 3 hours ago. He completely confessed to the entire medical fraud conspiracy the second we showed him the federal badge. He handed over the cash bribe you paid him, and he told us everything about your plan to lock your father-in-law in a psychiatric ward. We also have the full cooperation of your document forger, Paul Hayes. Your entire criminal operation is completely dismantled." The cold steel handcuffs snapped shut around Chloe's wrists with a sharp, definitive click. The metallic sound echoed through the dining room and seemed to finally shatter the thick wall of delusion she had built around herself. Her knees buckled completely. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor, weeping hysterically as the reality of a federal prison sentence crashed down on her shoulders. The agents tried to pull her up, but she dropped all her dead weight and dragged herself across the broken glass toward David. She crawled through the spilled, expensive wine, completely ruining her designer dress. "David, please," she sobbed, looking up at him with black mascara running down her pale face. "Honey, please save me. I was forced to do this. Trent manipulated me. He threatened me and made me steal that money. You know I love you, David. Please call your corporate lawyers. We have money. You can fix this. Do not let them take me away." David looked down at the pathetic woman kneeling at his feet. He held the blood-soaked white napkin tightly against his wounded arm, the same arm he had just used to save my life from her violent attack. He looked at her, not with anger and not with sadness, but with absolute, frozen indifference. He was finally seeing the monster hiding beneath her beautiful face. "You do not get to call me honey ever again," David said, his voice vibrating with a quiet, devastating power. "You did not just betray my trust and destroy our marriage. You tried to sell out my father. You tried to frame me for a federal crime, and you tried to lock an innocent old man inside a medical prison just so you could fund your pathetic affair." Chloe wept louder, reaching out with her handcuffed wrists to grasp the hem of his tailored suit pants. "I am sorry," she wailed. "I made a mistake. Please give me another chance." "You made your choices, Chloe," David replied, stepping entirely out of her reach. "Now you are going to pay the price all by yourself." He pulled his leg back, leaving her totally unsupported. Chloe fell forward, sobbing violently into the ruined tablecloth on the floor. She turned her tear-streaked face toward the corner of the room where her parents Richard and Patricia were cowering in absolute terror. "Mom, Dad, please do something," she begged, her voice cracking with pure agony. "Tell them who we are. Tell them I am innocent." Richard looked at the federal agents and then looked at his daughter with pure, unadulterated disgust. "We have absolutely nothing to do with this criminal," he told the lead agent, holding his hands up in immediate surrender. "She is an adult, and she is entirely responsible for her own actions. We do not know her anymore." Patricia nodded vigorously, pressing her back against the wall. "We wash our hands of her entirely," Patricia added, her voice shaking with fear. "She is a disgrace to our family name." Chloe let out a long, horrifying wail of pure agony. She was entirely abandoned. The greedy parents who taught her to worship money and status had just thrown her to the wolves to save their own reputations. They cared more about their frozen bank accounts than they cared about their own flesh and blood. The agents had seen enough. They hauled Chloe roughly to her feet, completely ignoring her dramatic sobs. They grabbed Trent by his collar, reading him his Miranda rights as they began marching them both toward the heavy oak doors. I placed my hand on David's uninjured shoulder, and we walked slowly behind the federal agents, following them out of the ruined private room. We stepped out into the main dining area of the luxury restaurant. The entire establishment had fallen completely silent. The soft classical music had been turned off by the management. Dozens of wealthy patrons, politicians, and powerful corporate executives had stopped eating their expensive meals. They were all standing by their tables, holding their crystal wine glasses, staring directly at the spectacular procession. Chloe was forced to walk through the exact center of the crowded dining room in cold steel handcuffs. Her beautiful beige dress was torn and covered in dark red stains. Her hair was a wild, tangled mess, and her face was twisted in absolute shame. The woman who wanted nothing more than to be worshipped and admired by high society was now being paraded right through the middle of it like a captured animal. She kept her head down, weeping bitterly, trying to hide her face from the countless cell phones recording her spectacular downfall. The restaurant patrons whispered and pointed, watching the greedy daughter-in-law take her final steps of freedom. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant opened, and the harsh flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers waiting outside illuminated her absolute and total disgrace in front of the entire city. The flashing red and blue lights slowly faded from the large glass windows of the restaurant. The sirens grew distant, blending back into the normal sounds of the city night. The private dining room, which just an hour ago was the setting for a high society execution, was now completely empty. Richard and Patricia had scurried out the back exit like terrified rats fleeing a sinking ship, refusing to even look in our direction. The restaurant staff had discreetly withdrawn, leaving us entirely alone in the ruined space. Only my son and I remained surrounded by broken crystal, overturned velvet chairs, and the dark stains of spilled wine. David sat heavily on one of the few remaining upright chairs. The adrenaline that had fueled his heroic leap across the room was completely gone, leaving behind a profound physical and emotional exhaustion. He stared down at his ruined suit jacket and the makeshift bandage I had pressed against his bleeding arm. The reality of the last 48 hours was crashing down on him with the weight of a collapsing building. He had loved that woman. He had worked 80-hour weeks, sacrificing his own health and happiness to build a life for her. And she had repaid his fierce loyalty by trying to bury him alive in a federal prison. Slowly, my strong, capable son began to break down. His broad shoulders shook violently. He buried his face in his uninjured hand and began to weep. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was the loud, agonizing sobbing of a man whose entire world had just been torn to shreds. He cried like a small child, completely stripped of all his corporate armor and adult defenses. "Dad," he choked out, his voice raw and thick with tears. "I am so sorry. I am so unbelievably sorry. I was completely blind. I was so exhausted and so focused on my work that I let a monster into our family. I let her disrespect you. I let her plot against you. I was supposed to protect you, and I was too weak and stupid to even see what she was doing right under my own roof. I did not offer him empty platitudes. I did not tell him that everything was perfectly fine, because it was not." I walked over to the wooden sideboard where the waiters kept their supplies and pulled out a fresh, clean linen towel and a bottle of high-proof clear alcohol from the bar. I walked back to my son, pulling a chair up right directly in front of him. "Give me your arm, David," I commanded, my voice firm and steady. He extended his trembling arm. I unwrapped the blood-soaked napkin. The cut was deep, but it had not hit the main artery. I poured the clear alcohol over the wound. David hissed in pain, his muscles locking up, but he did not pull away. I wrapped the clean linen tightly around his forearm, binding it with the precise care of a father who has spent a lifetime fixing his son's broken pieces. When the wound was firmly secured, I placed both of my hands squarely on his shoulders and forced him to look up at me. His eyes were red and filled with deep, agonizing shame. "Stand up, David," I said, my voice dropping to a low, resonant rumble. "I told you to stand up right now." He slowly pushed himself out of the chair, standing tall before me, though his shoulders were still slumped. "Listen to me very closely, son," I told him, looking directly into his tear-filled eyes. "A real man does not cry over parasites. You shed your tears for people who have earned your love and loyalty. Chloe never earned a single drop of your sweat, let alone your tears. You are not weak. You threw yourself in front of a blade to protect your father. That is not weakness, David. That is the definition of absolute strength. You made a mistake in trusting the wrong woman, but you did not fail this family. David swallowed hard, wiping his face with the back of his uninjured hand. "But Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling with sheer terror. "The logistics firm. The federal regulators are coming tomorrow morning. The corporate auditors already handed my file over. She routed $500,000 using my computer. I am going to be arrested at sunrise. My career is completely over. I am going to federal prison." I kept my hands firmly on his shoulders, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Nobody is coming for you tomorrow morning, David," I said, my tone radiating absolute, unwavering certainty. He stared at me in total confusion. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaking. "You heard the recording. The corporate board already filed the federal complaint against me." I let go of his shoulders and took a step back, adjusting my suit jacket. "Do you honestly believe I would spend 48 hours setting a federal trap for your wife and leave your corporate flank completely exposed?" I asked him, raising my voice just enough to fill the silent room. "I am a forensic accountant's son. I never leave a ledger unbalanced." I reached into my inside pocket and pulled out a single folded sheet of thick premium paper. I handed it to him. "Yesterday morning, while you were dealing with the chaos at the office, I took a little trip to your corporate headquarters," I explained calmly. "I bypassed your security and had a very direct conversation with your chief financial officer. Once I identified the exact amount of money Chloe had stolen from your logistics firm, I immediately initiated a high-priority wire transfer from my own secure retirement funds. I replaced every single missing dollar directly back into the corporate holding accounts." David unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It was an official signed letter from the chief executive officer of his logistics firm. I brought in my own high-powered legal team. I continued walking him through the absolute salvation of his life. We presented the corporate board with irrefutable digital evidence that your computer was accessed externally by an unauthorized party. We showed them the exact timestamps proving you were asleep when the transfers were made. We proved that Chloe was the sole architect of the embezzlement. Because I made the company entirely financially whole before the federal regulators initiated their raid, the board of directors agreed to completely withdraw their criminal complaint against you. David read the letter, his eyes scanning the corporate seal and the signatures over and over again. "You are completely clear, David." I told him, my voice filled with deep paternal pride. "The board knows you are an innocent victim in this. They know how hard you have worked for them. You still have your job. You still have your stellar reputation. You do not owe a single dime. You are entirely safe." David looked up from the paper, his hands shaking so violently the letter made a sharp rustling sound. The crushing weight of a 20-year federal prison sentence was instantly lifted from his chest. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a profound, overwhelming gratitude that simply could not be put into words. He closed the distance between us and wrapped his good arm around my shoulders, hugging me with a fierce, desperate strength. I hugged my boy back, holding him tight in the center of the ruined dining room. We stood there for a long time, letting the silence wash over us. The storm had passed. The toxic parasite that had infected our lives had been completely surgically removed. "Let us go home, son," I said finally, patting him gently on the back. "We have a lot of rebuilding to do." We walked out of the elegant restaurant together, leaving the broken glass and the spilled wine behind us. We stepped out into the crisp, cool night air, breathing in the absolute freedom of a brand new beginning. 6 months later, that crisp air was replaced by the stifling, heavy atmosphere of a federal courthouse. The grand trial that had captivated the city for weeks was finally reaching its ultimate conclusion, and I was sitting in the front row waiting for the judge to deliver the final absolute verdict. The air inside the federal courthouse was cold and completely sterile. It was the smell of absolute finality. I sat in the front row of the gallery with my son David sitting tall and steady right beside me. We watched the heavy wooden doors open as the federal marshals led Chloe and Trent into the courtroom. They were no longer wearing their expensive designer clothes or their luxury watches. They were wearing standard-issue orange prison jumpsuits with their wrists securely bound in heavy steel chains. Chloe looked absolutely entirely broken. Her hair had lost its expensive shine and her face was pale and hollow. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, unable to look at the man she had promised to love or the father-in-law she had tried to destroy. The federal judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for white-collar predators, adjusted her glasses and looked down from the bench. She did not mince her words. She told Chloe that her crimes were not born of desperation, but of pure malicious greed. She outlined how Chloe had systematically manipulated a family, forged federal documents, and attempted to lock a perfectly healthy senior citizen inside a psychiatric facility just to fund a lavish lifestyle. The judge stated that exploiting the elderly and weaponizing the medical system were some of the most despicable acts a person could commit. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent room. Chloe was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. In the federal system, there is no early parole for good behavior. She would serve every single day of those 15 years in a concrete box. Chloe let out a pathetic, whimpering sob and collapsed into her chair, but nobody in the room felt an ounce of pity for her. Trent was next. The judge looked at him with equal disgust. For his role in establishing the offshore shell accounts and conspiring to launder stolen corporate funds, Trent was handed a harsh 10-year sentence. He did not cry. He just stared blankly ahead, his arrogant smirk permanently erased from his face. I turned my head slightly and looked toward the back of the gallery. Richard and Patricia were sitting in the very last row. They looked like ghosts of their former selves. They were not wearing their custom suits or their sequin dresses. They looked tired, aged, and entirely defeated. Their presence in the courtroom was not to support their daughter, but because they were deeply entangled in the fallout of her crimes. When Chloe had wired that $75,000 into their primary wealth management account, she had triggered a massive federal audit. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division had torn through their finances with absolute ruthlessness. The authorities seized their bank accounts under federal asset forfeiture laws, claiming the funds were mixed with illicit corporate money. Richard and Patricia had been forced to liquidate their massive properties, their luxury vehicles, and their stock portfolios just to pay their own defense attorneys and avoid going to prison themselves. They had lost absolutely everything. The wealthy, arrogant parents who had spent an entire dinner humiliating my son for not being rich enough were now completely and utterly bankrupt. They were currently living in a cramped rented apartment in a bad part of town, experiencing the exact same poverty they had spent their entire lives mocking. The universe has a beautiful way of balancing its own ledgers. The federal marshals pulled Chloe and Trent to their feet, leading them toward the holding cells at the back of the courtroom. Chloe turned her head one last time, looking over her shoulder at David. Her eyes begged for a sliver of forgiveness, for a single look of sympathy. But David did not give her anything. He just looked at her with the calm, empty gaze of a man who had completely moved on. The heavy doors slammed shut behind her, sealing her fate forever. David and I stood up from the wooden benches and walked slowly down the center aisle. We pushed open the main doors of the federal building and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. The warmth hit my face, and for the first time in 6 months, I took a deep, full breath of completely clean air. The heavy, toxic cloud that had been suffocating our family was finally gone. David stood next to me, looking out at the busy city streets. He rolled up his sleeves, letting the sunlight hit his skin. On his left forearm, there was a long, thick scar where the steak knife had cut him. It was completely healed now. It was no longer a wound. It was a permanent badge of honor, a physical reminder of the night he proved his absolute loyalty. "It is really over, Dad," he said, his voice sounding lighter and freer than I had heard it in years. "We actually survived." "We did more than survive, son," I told him, placing a firm hand on his back. "We took out the trash and we cleared the foundation. Now we get to rebuild." David nodded, a genuine smile breaking across his face. "I was thinking about the old house," he said, turning to look at me. "There are a lot of good memories there, but there are also a lot of shadows. I do not think I want to walk past that home office ever again." I smiled back at him because I had been thinking the exact same thing. I told him we were going to put the property on the market next week. With the money from the sale and my retirement funds, we were going to leave the crowded city behind. I told him we were going to buy a large plot of land out in the peaceful, quiet suburbs. We would build 2 houses on the same property, one for him to start his new life, and one for me with a big wooden porch where I could sit and drink my coffee in peace. "That sounds absolutely perfect, Dad," David said, clapping me on the shoulder. We walked down the wide concrete steps of the courthouse together. As we walked, I looked down at my clothes. I was not wearing the custom-tailored charcoal suit I had worn to the restaurant that night. I was wearing my scuffed leather boots, a simple pair of denim jeans, and my old faded flannel shirt. I wore the expensive suit that night because I needed to speak the language of corporate predators. I needed to show them the massive, terrifying power they had foolishly awakened. But I did not need that power anymore. I did not need to intimidate anyone or prove my worth to people who worshipped bank accounts. I wore my old faded flannel because it was comfortable, because it was honest, and because it was exactly who I was. I was a man who had built his wealth quietly, protected his family fiercely, and found absolute peace in the simple things. I did not wear the old clothes because I was a poor, naive old man. I wore them because I had absolutely nothing left to prove to the world. The audit was officially closed and the balance was perfectly clear. Greed is a poison that blinds the mind and rots the soul. Those who underestimate the quiet strength of the elderly often mistake silence for weakness and patience for foolishness. But true power does not need to shout. It waits, observes, and strikes when the time is right. Family is not defined by marriage certificates or empty promises, but by loyalty and unwavering respect. When you try to bury those who built the foundation you stand on, do not be surprised when they become the earthquake that shatters your entire world. Justice may be silent, but it never forgets. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If this story resonated with you, or if you have ever had to teach a hard lesson to someone who underestimated you, please leave a comment below and share your experience. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories about justice, family, and the power of truth. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and I will see you in the next video.